Albertsbridge Books presents A Christmas Carol, a Greyhound ghost story of Christmas, written by Charles Dickens and John Gaspard, read by Jim Cunningham. Frontispiece quote: "You should keep dogs." Charles Dickens, The Posthumous Papers of the Pickwick Club. Preface. What follows is Charles Dickens' classic A Christmas Carol. Mostly. It's the same story, the same characters, and much of the same dialogue. What's different? Well, it's a little shorter, a little leaner, a little less verbose in some sections, but the chief alteration is that it's now narrated by a dog. A greyhound, in fact, named Carl. In the following pages, Carl tells his story of a Christmas which changed his life and the life of his master, Ebenezer Scrooge. So settle back, grab a cup of tea, start a fire in the fireplace, put your feet up, and enjoy A Christmas Carol. Stave 1. Marley's Ghost. Marley was dead, to begin with. That's as good a starting point as any, I suppose. I was a mere pup at the time, but I remember it well. I think one will always vividly recall meeting and losing a new master of the very same day. To the best of my comprehension at the time, I was reimbursement of some sort for a long unpaid loan, a last-ditch effort on the part of my previous owner to settle accounts with the demanding Mr. Marley. At the very moment of exchange, I recognized I was to be more chattel than cherished pet. There was no fawning, no excited exclamations concerning the thick richness of my brindle coat or the ivory whiteness of my teeth. My speed and agility went unmentioned. My warm personality was, apparently, a moot point. I received, at best, a cursory glance from Mr. Marley, a grunt of acceptance, and then a hurried note was scratched quickly in a thick ledger. It was unclear at that moment if his vision for me was coursing or breeding, that is, if he had any grand scheme for me at all. However, I must have proven to be an acceptable payment, for my previous master departed, and Mr. Marley took me into his office. With a low, unintelligible grumble, he indicated a pile of rags on the floor. It was understood I was to make that spot my bed. Ironically, Mr. Marley took to his own bed several hours later, and by the next morning, he was dead. There was no doubt whatsoever about that. The register of his burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, and the undertaker. Finally, his chief mourner, Scrooge, signed it. And, as I would come to understand in ways great and small, Scrooge's name was good for anything he chose to put his hand to. Yes, we must be clear on this. Old Marley was as dead as a doornail. Mind you, I don't mean to say I know what there is particularly dead about a doornail. If pressed to do so, I might have been inclined myself to regard a coffin nail as the deadest piece of ironmongery in the trade. However, without further digression, permit me to repeat emphatically that Marley was as dead as a doornail. This must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come of the story I'm about to relate. Scrooge knew he was dead? Of course he did. He also understood he was now the possessor, proud or otherwise, of a year-old greyhound named Carl. I remember our moment of meeting distinctly. He surveyed me as he did the rest of old Marley's possessions, for each and every one of those articles was now his. Scrooge was Marley's sole executor, his sole beneficiary, his sole friend, and his sole mourner. However, I recognized at once that Scrooge was not so dreadfully cut up by the sad event of Marley's untimely passing. What limited skill I possess at reading human emotions indicated very few on Scrooge's part. He was an excellent man of business, though, striking a sharp bargain on the expense of his deceased partner's funeral. It was a sad and underpopulated affair, consisting of Scrooge, an officiant, and myself. I lay quietly at Scrooge's feet throughout the short service, uncertain to the point of nervousness as to what might lie ahead for me. Scrooge made no remark to me after the funeral. I merely followed him home and have been by his side to this day. He has never been cruel, nor has he been fawning. I was fed and sheltered with no comment. I quickly came to understand I was merely one of the possessions he inherited from his former partner, and that was the end of it. Scrooge never painted out old Marley's name. There it stood, years afterwards, above our warehouse door, Scrooge and Marley. Oftentimes people new to the business called Scrooge Scrooge, and sometimes Marley, but he answered to both names. It was all the same to him. For myself, I respond with equal enthusiasm to Carl, or you, or even the slightly dismissive dog. Scrooge treated me with greater respect than his employees and his customers, which, as you will come to learn, is not the highest of compliments. As for friends, I appeared to be his only. I must confess, a few short moments spent in his company, and it was easy to see why. Oh, but he was a tight-fisted hand at the grindstone, was Scrooge. A squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. Hard and sharp as flint, secret and self-contained and solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his old features. He carried his own low temperature always about with him, and didn't thaw 1 degree at Christmas. No one ever stopped him in the street to say with a wide smile, "My dear Scrooge, how are you? When will you come to see me?" No beggars implored him to bestow a trifle. No children asked him what it was o'clock. No man or woman ever once inquired the way to such and such a place of Scrooge. Even with me walking steadily at his side, and I can modestly state of myself, a happier, more welcoming fellow you are unlikely to encounter, was not enough to draw people toward Scrooge. But what did Scrooge care? It was the very thing he liked, to edge his way along the crowded paths of life, warning all human sympathy to keep its distance, was, I believe, what he lived for. Until one fateful Yuletide. Once upon a time, of all the good days in the year, on Christmas Eve, old Scrooge sat busy in his counting-house. It was cold, bleak, biting weather. I could hear the people in the court outside go wheezing up and down, beating their hands upon their breasts and stamping their feet upon the pavement stones to warm them. The city clocks had only just struck 3, but it was quite dark already. It had not been light all day, and candles were flaring in the windows of the neighboring offices. The door of Scrooge's office was open, that we might keep our eyes upon the clerk, who sat in a dismal little cell beyond, copying letters. Scrooge had a very small fire, which I was curled up close to. The clerk's fire was so very much smaller, appearing to consist of a single small coal. I felt for the young man, Bob Cratchit, but we both knew he couldn't replenish his meager fire. Scrooge kept the coal box in a corner of our room, and we, all three, understood if the clerk came in with the shovel, the master was as likely to terminate his employment as not. With this understanding, Cratchit pulled on his white comforter and tried to warm himself at the candle, in which effort, not being a man of strong imagination, he failed. Myself, huddled by Scrooge's small fire, felt sadness for his situation and saw little to no recourse I could attempt on his behalf. Although I sat at the foot of the master, I had no real say in the actions of the office. While Scrooge tossed an occasional rhetorical or sarcastic comment in my direction, mine was not a pivotal role in the running of the business, which was just as well, as I was more than content to spend my days preparing to nap, napping, or awaking from a nap. Outside of coursing and eating, that was where my unique skills were best employed. My musings, such as they were interrupted by a loud but familiar voice. "A Merry Christmas, Uncle! God save you!" cried the cheerful voice. It was Scrooge's nephew, Fred. He came upon us so quickly, this joyful sound was the first intimation we had of his approach. "Bah!" snapped Scrooge without looking up. "Humbug!" Fred was all in a glow. His face was ruddy and handsome, and his eyes sparkled. "Christmas a humbug, Uncle," said Fred. "You don't mean that, I'm sure." "I do," said Scrooge. "Merry Christmas. What reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough." "Come, then," returned Fred gaily. "What right have you to be dismal? You're rich enough." I knew Scrooge well enough to know that on that subject of being rich enough he was well versed. However, evidently he was in no mood for an extended exchange on the topic. "Bah!" he said again, and followed it up with "humbug." "Don't be cross, Uncle," said Fred. He knelt down and gave each of my ears a gentle rub, a habit we had formed of many years, and one for which I was always pleased to be upon the receiving end. "What else can I be when I live in such a world of fools as this?" returned Scrooge. "Merry Christmas. What's Christmas time to you but a time for paying bills without money? A time for finding yourself a year older and not an hour richer? If I could work my will, every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled with his own pudding and buried with a stick of holly through his heart." "Uncle," pleaded Fred. "Nephew," returned Scrooge sternly. "Keep it," repeated Fred, "but you don't keep it." "Let me leave it alone, then," said Scrooge. "Much good may it do you. Much good it has ever done you." "There are many things from which I have derived good by which I have not profited, I dare say," returned Fred. "Christmas among the best." Fred removed one of his gloves and reached deep within his heavy overcoat, tossing a wink toward me as he searched within his pocket. I believe he made a bit more of a show of his actions than might have been entirely necessary. Finally, a smile lit upon his face as he pulled the treasure from the dark depths and handed it down to me. It was a small, dried biscuit, and it held the slightest smell of meat to it. I crunched it happily, and then attempted to return to my nap, as I was behind my time in that regard. However, the human-spirited conversation stood between me and sleep. "But I'm sure I've always thought of Christmas time as a good time," continued Fred. "A kind, forgiving, charitable, pleasant time. The only time I know of in the long calendar of the year when men and women seem to open their shut-up hearts freely. And therefore, Uncle, though it has never put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket, I believe that it has done me good, and will do me good, and I say, God bless it." This sentiment inspired Cratchit to break into a short burst of muted applause, for the clerk was wearing his gloves while working, in his futile attempt to keep warm. Scrooge slowly turned his attention in the direction of the young clerk. Cratchit became immediately sensible of the impropriety, and in an effort to suggest he had just been clapping his hands together to create warmth, he poked at his small fire. This action resulted in the exact opposite of his intended result, extinguishing the last frail spark forever. "Let me hear another sound from you," snapped Scrooge, "and you'll keep your Christmas by losing your situation." As if to rebuke the young clerk even further, he moved to his own fire and stoked it briefly, which resulted in bringing the small ember back to life. While I was happy to receive the increased warmth, I felt sympathy for Cratchit's small cell, which was likely to grow even colder. "You're quite a powerful speaker, sir," continued Scrooge, as he returned his attention toward his nephew. "I wonder you don't go into Parliament." "Don't be cross, Uncle. Come, dine with us tomorrow. Bring young Carl here, and we shall make a party of the evening." My ears perked up at the sound of this invitation. I looked to my master, hopeful he would find the idea equally compelling, but his expression told me he did not share my enthusiasm for the proposed engagement. "I will see you in," Scrooge muttered. I will omit the totality of his outburst, but suffice it to say, he went the whole length of the expression and said that he would see Fred in that extremity first. "But why?" cried Fred. "Why?" "Why did you get married?" said Scrooge. "Because I fell in love." "Because you fell in love," growled Scrooge, as if this idea were the only thing in the world more ridiculous than a Merry Christmas. "Good afternoon." Fred took a step toward his uncle. "Nay, but you never came to see me before my marriage. Why give it as a reason for not coming now?" "Good afternoon," said Scrooge. Fred looked at his uncle for a long moment. I saw what I took to be sadness move across his face. His voice became so quiet I had to raise my ears to capture the sound. "I want nothing from you. I ask nothing of you. Why cannot we be friends?" "Good afternoon," said Scrooge. Fred blinked at his uncle while he considered the response. He bent down, gave my left ear another welcome scratch, and then stood to face his uncle. "I'm sorry with all my heart to find you so resolute, but I'll keep my Christmas humor to the last. So, a Merry Christmas, Uncle." "Good afternoon," said Scrooge. Fred turned to go, and then spun back round. "And a Happy New Year." Scrooge jumped and continued to scowl. "Good afternoon," snapped Scrooge. Fred made his way toward the door, stopping to offer Cratchit the greetings of the season. Unfamiliar with the concept of kindness within these walls, it took a moment for the young clerk to remember how to respond. As cold as he was, I could tell Cratchit's nature was warmer than Scrooge, for he returned Fred's sentiments cordially. The two men spoke and laughed, and it felt to me that the entire office was warmer for their interaction. Scrooge saw I was closely studying the conversation. "There's another fellow," muttered Scrooge in my direction. "My clerk, with 15 shillings a week, and a wife and family talking about a Merry Christmas. I'll retire to Bedlam." I felt, and not for the first time, Scrooge may have been expecting a verbal response of some variety from me. Lacking the ability, I instead wagged my tail and lowered my eyes deferentially, hoping I could return to my treasured afternoon nap. Sadly, that was not to be. No sooner had Fred disappeared through the front door than it reopened almost immediately. Two portly gentlemen entered. They spotted Scrooge at his desk, and removing their hats as they walked, they approached him in high spirits. They had books and papers in their hands and bowed to him. "Scrooge and Marley's, I believe," said one of the gentlemen, referring to his list. "Have I the pleasure of addressing Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley?" "Marley is dead," Scrooge replied. "He died 7 years ago this very night." This sad news did little to distract the gentleman, who appeared to be working from an oft-spoken script. "Well, we have no doubt his generosity will be well represented by his surviving partner," said the gentleman, presenting his credentials. Scrooge barely glanced at the papers and returned his attention to the ledger in front of him. The two gentlemen exchanged a look. one prodding the other to step forward. After a moment's hesitation, he did just that. I felt sorry for both of them, for I knew from past experience this encounter was unlikely to result in a pleasing outcome for them. "At this festive season of the year, Mr. Scrooge," said the gentleman, taking up a pen, "it is more than usually desirable that we should make some slight provision for the poor and destitute who suffer greatly at this present time. Many thousands are in want of common necessities. Hundreds of thousands are in want of common comforts." "Are there no prisons?" asked Scrooge without looking up. "Plenty of prisons," said the gentleman, laying down the pen again. "And the Union workhouses?" demanded Scrooge. "Are they still in operation?" "They are still," returned the gentleman. "I wish I could say they were not." "The treadmill is in full vigor, then?" said Scrooge. "Very busy, sir." "Oh, I was afraid from what you said at first that something had occurred to stop them in their useful course," said Scrooge. "I am very glad to hear it." He grinned down at me, as he appeared to feel I might be a more accepting audience for his remarks. I recognized his tone as sarcasm, a type of communication which often flies right over my head. But I blinked up at him anyway, which had become my custom when I was unsure of his meaning. "They scarcely furnish Christian cheer," returned the gentleman, "so a few of us are endeavoring to raise a fund, to buy the poor some meat and drink and means of warmth. We choose this time because it is a time of all others when want is keenly felt and abundance rejoices. What shall I put you down for?" "Nothing," Scrooge replied. "Ah, you wish to be anonymous?" "I wish to be left alone," said Scrooge. "Since you ask me what I wish, gentlemen, that is my answer. I don't make merry myself at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry. I help to support the establishments I have mentioned. They cost enough. Those who are badly off must go there." "Many can't go there, and many would rather die." "If they would rather die, then they had better do it, and decrease the surplus population," said Scrooge. "It's enough for a man to understand his own business, and not to interfere with other people's. Mine occupies me constantly. Good afternoon, gentlemen." Seeing clearly that it would be useless to pursue their point, the gentleman withdrew. I recognized Scrooge was unlikely to act as host, so I slowly stood and guided the two men toward our front door, offering them the most sympathetic look I could muster as we made our way through the office. Once they had departed, I looked through the grimy glass of the front window as the men moved down the street toward what I hoped would be a more fruitful appointment. The fog and darkness had thickened, so that people ran about with flaring links, proffering their services to go before horses and carriages and conduct them on their way. The ancient tower of a church, whose gruff old bell was always peeping down at us out of a Gothic window in the wall, became invisible. But it still struck the hours and quarters in the clouds with tremulous vibrations afterwards, as if its teeth were chattering in its frozen head up there. A young lad appeared in front of the window, shivering in the hungry cold. He peered in and began to regale the office with a Christmas carol. But at the first sound of "God rest you, merry gentlemen, may nothing you dismay," Scrooge roared from his desk, seizing a ruler with such energy of action that the singer fled in terror. With a disgusted grunt, Scrooge returned to his ledger, and I to my pile of rags near the fire. I exchanged a quick, sympathetic look with Cratchit, and then we each silently returned to our tasks, his at the ledger in front of him, and me at the nap, which was hovering in the air before me. At length, the hour of shutting up the counting-house arrived. With an ill will, Scrooge dismounted from his stool and tacitly admitted the fact to the expectant clerk. Cratchit instantly snuffed his candle out and put on his hat. "You'll want all day tomorrow, I suppose?" said Scrooge. "If it's quite convenient, sir," "It's not convenient," said Scrooge, "and it's not fair. If I was to stop you 1/2 crown for it, you'd think yourself ill-used, I'll be bound." Cratchit smiled faintly. Like me, he recognized a rhetorical question when it was presented to him. "And yet," Scrooge continued, "you don't think me ill-used when I pay a day's wages for no work." "Christmas comes but once a year, Mr. Scrooge," offered Cratchit. "A poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December," said Scrooge, buttoning his great coat to the chin. "But I suppose you must have the whole day. However, be here all the earlier next morning." Cratchit promised that he would. The office was closed in a twinkling, and the clerk, with the long ends of his white comforter dangling below his waist, ran home toward Camden Town as hard as he could. Scrooge took his usual melancholy dinner in his usual melancholy tavern. My meal consisted of some scraps from his plate, as well as a few more choice pieces from the kindly barkeep. She had taken a silent liking to me and often slipped me treats, first ensuring her actions went unnoticed by Scrooge. He rejected kindness in all its forms, whether it was directed at him personally or to those around him. After dining, and having read all the newspapers and beguiled the rest of the evening with his banker's book, we finally made our way to home. We lived in chambers which had once belonged to his deceased partner and my short-lived owner. They were a gloomy suite of rooms, and dreary enough, for nobody lived in it but Scrooge, the other rooms being all let out as offices. The yard was so dark that even Scrooge, who knew its every stone, was fain to grope with his hands and to rely on my keener sight to get us safely to the doorstep. Now, it is a fact that there was nothing at all particular about the knocker on the door, except that it was very large. It is also a fact that Scrooge and I had seen it night and morning during our whole residence in that place. Let it also be borne in mind that as far as I could perceive, Scrooge had not bestowed even one thought on Marley since his last mention of his 7 years dead partner that afternoon. I certainly had not. My experience with the man was so short-lived that had his name not hung above our office door, it would likely never have come to my mind. So, then let any creature explain to me, if he can, how the following occurred. Scrooge, having his key in the lock of the door, and I, standing at his side, both suddenly saw in that knocker the image of Marley's face. It had a dismal light about it. It was not angry or ferocious, but looked at the two of us as Marley used to look, with ghostly spectacles turned up on his ghostly forehead. The hair was curiously stirred, as if by a breath of hot air, and though the eyes were wide open, they were perfectly motionless. As Scrooge and I stared fixedly at this phenomena, it was suddenly a knocker yet again. To say we were not startled, or that our blood was not conscious of a terrible sensation to which it had been a stranger from infancy, would be untrue. But we each exchanged a look, and then Scrooge put his hand back upon the key he had relinquished. He turned it sturdily, and we walked into the dark chamber. He did pause with a moment's irresolution before he shut the door, and he did look cautiously behind it first, as if he half expected to be terrified with the sight of Marley's pigtail sticking out into the hall. But there was nothing on the back of the door except the screws and nuts that held the knocker in place. So he snapped "pull, pull," and closed it with a bang. The sound resounded through the house like thunder. Every room above and every cask in the wine merchant's cellars below appeared to have a separate peal of echoes of its own. Scrooge was not a man to be frightened by echoes, and I shared this trait. He fastened the door and walked across the hall and up the stairs. Normally, I would bound up the flight ahead of him, but of this evening, I mirrored his slow pace, sniffing ahead of us, while Scrooge trimmed his candle as he went. Up we climbed the dim staircase, which was just as dark as other nights. Darkness is cheap, and Scrooge always favored cheapness in all its forms. But on this evening, Scrooge took precautions which were new to his nature. Before he shut the heavy door to our rooms, he walked through each to see that all was right, with me providing support at his side. I suspect he had just enough recollection of the face in the knocker to desire to make this minute inspection. I approved wholeheartedly of the sentiment. Sitting room, bedroom, lumber room, all as they should be. Nobody under the table, nobody under the sofa. I leaned down and peered under the lower furniture to confirm his findings. Nobody under the bed, nobody in the closet, nobody in his dressing gown, which was hanging up in a suspicious attitude against the wall. Quite satisfied, he closed the door and locked us in, then double-locked us in, which was not his custom. Thus secured against surprise, he put on his dressing gown and slippers and his nightcap and sat down before the fire to take his gruel. It was a very low fire indeed. We were obliged to sit close to it and brood over it before we could extract the least sensation of warmth from such a handful of fuel. I believed at that moment Scrooge was getting more warmth from my body than from the grate, for indeed I felt him sit closer to me than was his custom. Whether it was from the experience with the knocker or the limitations of the fireplace, I could not say. I turned my head, scanning the dark corners of the room. My glance happened to rest upon a bell, a disused bell that hung in the room. It was designed to communicate for some purpose now forgotten with the chamber in the highest story of the building. It was with great astonishment and with a strange, inexplicable dread that as I looked, I saw this bell begin to swing. It swung so softly in the outset that it scarcely made a sound, but soon it rang out loudly, and so did every bell in the house. Scrooge turned his head sharply at the sound, eyeing the bells with caution. He then looked to me, as if seeking an explanation. I had none in my possession, nor the words to express such if I'd had. This ringing might have lasted half a minute or a minute, but it seemed an hour. The bells ceased as they had begun, altogether. They were then suddenly succeeded by a clanking noise, deep down below, as if some person were dragging a heavy chain over the casks in the wine merchant's cellar. We heard the cellar door fly open with a booming sound, and then heard the noise much louder on the floors below, then coming up the stairs, then coming straight towards our door. "It's humbug, Carl," said Scrooge, straining to present a tone of bravery. "I won't believe it." As he spoke the words, he pushed himself away from the noise and closer to me. The sound continued, and Scrooge appeared to turn pale as it came on through the heavy door and passed into the room before our eyes. It took shape, and as difficult as it was to believe, to my eyes, it was the shape of Marley himself. It was certainly the same face as had appeared in the door-knocker. Marley, in his pigtail, waistcoat, tights, and boots. Though I had met the man but once, his was a face not soon forgotten. The chain he drew was clasped about his middle. It was long and wound about him like a tail. It was made, for I observed it closely, and I know Scrooge did as well, of cash boxes, keys, ledgers, and heavy purses wrought in steel. His body was transparent, so that observing him and looking through his waistcoat, one could see the 2 buttons on his coat behind. Though we saw this phantom standing before us, we were still incredulous at the sight and fought against our senses. Scrooge reached down with one hand and gently tugged upon my collar, I think to reassure himself primarily that he was not indeed alone. I offered what I hoped was a soothing whimper in return. "Now," said Scrooge, caustic and cold as ever. "What do you want with me?" "Much," came Marley's voice, no doubt about it. "Who are you?" "Ask me who I was." "Who were you, then?" said Scrooge, raising his voice. "You're particular for a shade." "In life, I was your partner, Jacob Marley." Can you sit down?" asked Scrooge, looking doubtfully at him. "I can." "Do it, then." The ghost sat down on the opposite side of the fireplace, as if he were quite used to doing so. I suppose that made sense, as he had once been the owner of these rooms. He glanced down in my direction, and I think I noticed a glimmer of recognition in his milky eyes. He returned his gaze onto Scrooge. "You don't believe in me," observed the ghost. "I don't," said Scrooge. "Why? Do you doubt your senses?" "I do," said Scrooge, "because little things affect them. A slight disorder of the stomach makes them cheat. You may be an undigested bit of beef, blot of mustard, a crumb of cheese, a fragment of an underdone potato. There's more of gravy than of grave about you, whatever you are." Scrooge was not much in the habit of cracking jokes, so this jibe surprised me. The truth is, I think he tried to be smart as a means of distracting his own attention and keeping down his terror, for the specter's voice disturbed the very marrow in my bones, so I can only imagine what it was doing to his. "Well," snapped Scrooge, "humbug, I tell you, humbug!" In response, the spirit raised a frightful cry and shook its chains. It was such a dismal and appalling noise that Scrooge held on tight to his chair to save himself from falling in a swoon. I, too, in my crouched position next to him, pushed my body back away from the ghost. In response, the spirit raised a frightful cry and shook its chains. It was such a dismal and appalling noise that Scrooge held on tight to his chair to save himself from falling in a swoon. I, too, in my crouched position next to him, pushed my body back away from the ghost. And then it did the most awful thing. The spirit pulled the bandage from round his head, and at that moment, his lower jaw dropped down upon his breast. Scrooge fell upon his knees and clasped his hands before his face. It was all I could do not to howl in fear. I, too, inched downward, straining to push my body even closer to the floor in a pose of desperate supplication. "Mercy!" Scrooge cried. "Dreadful apparition, why do you trouble me?" "Man of the worldly mind," replied the ghost, "do you believe in me or not?" "I do," said Scrooge quickly. "I must. But why do spirits walk the earth, and why do they come to me?" "It is required of every man that the spirit within him should walk abroad among his fellow men," the ghost returned. "And if that spirit goes not forth in life, it is condemned to do so after death. It is doomed to wander through the world and witness what it cannot share, but might have shared on earth and turned to happiness." Again the spectre raised a cry and shook its chains and wrung its shadowy hands. "You are fettered, Jacob," said Scrooge, trembling. "Tell me why." "I wear the chain I forged in life," replied the ghost. "I made it, link by link and yard by yard. I girded it on of my own free will, and of my own free will I wore it. Is its pattern strange to you?" Scrooge trembled more and more. "Or would you know the weight and length of the strong coil you bear yourself?" pursued the ghost. "Yours was as full, as heavy, and as long as this 7 Christmas Eves ago. You have labored on its sense. It is a ponderous chain." Scrooge glanced about him on the floor in the expectation of finding himself surrounded by some 50 or 60 fathoms of iron cable, but he could see nothing. For myself, if I squinted, I was certain I could see something dim but heavily wrapped around the frightened old man. But as quickly as it appeared, it was gone. "Jacob Marley," Scrooge said imploringly, "speak comfort to me." "I have none to give," the ghost replied. "I cannot rest. I cannot stay. I cannot linger anywhere. In life, my spirit never roamed beyond the narrow confines of our money-changing hole. Now only weary journeys lie before me." "But you were always a good man of business, Jacob," offered Scrooge. "Business?" cried the ghost, wringing its hands. "Mankind was my business. The common welfare was my business. Charity, mercy, forbearance, and benevolence were all my business. The dealings of my trade were but a drop of water in the comprehensive ocean of my business." It held up its chain at arm's length, as if that were the cause of all its unavailing grief, and flung it heavily upon the ground again. He glanced at Scrooge as he spoke. "How is it that I appear before you in a shape that you can see? I may not tell, but know this. I have sat invisible beside you many and many a day. That was no light part of my penance." This, I could perceive, was not an agreeable idea. Scrooge shivered and wiped the perspiration from his brow. He looked down at me as if to ask, "Did you ever see this shape sitting alongside me?" I had no answer to offer, but in my mind I thought back to my days on the floor near Scrooge's desk. Had I sensed something to which I could give no name? Perhaps I had. "I am here tonight to warn you that you have yet a chance and hope of escaping my fate," continued the ghost. "A chance and hope of my procuring, Ebenezer." "You were always a good friend to me," said Scrooge. "You will be haunted by 3 spirits." Scrooge's countenance fell almost as low as the ghost had done. "Is that the chance and hope you mentioned, Jacob?" he demanded in a faltering voice. "It is." I think I'd rather not," said Scrooge. "Without their visits, you cannot hope to shun the path I tread," said the ghost. "Expect the first tomorrow, when the bell tolls 1. "Couldn't I take them all at once and have it over, Jacob?" hinted Scrooge. "Expect the second on the next night at the same hour, the third upon the next night, when the last stroke of 12 has ceased to vibrate. Look to see me no more, and for your own sake, you remember what has passed between us." After it had spoken these words, the spectre took its wrapper from the table and bound it round its head as before. The apparition then walked backward from us, and at every step it took, the window raised itself a little, so that when the spectre reached it, it was wide open. It beckoned Scrooge to approach, which he did, with me slinking along his heels. When Scrooge and I were within 2 paces of him, Marley's ghost held up his hand, warning us to come no nearer. Scrooge stopped, and I did as well, nearly colliding with my master. On the raising of the hand, we became aware of confused noises in the air, incoherent sounds of lamentation and regret, wailings inexpressibly sorrowful and self-accusatory. The spectre, after listening for a moment, joined in the mournful dirge. He then, without seeming effort, floated out upon the bleak, dark night. Scrooge followed to the window. Desperate in curiosity, I followed. We both looked through the open window into the night sky. The air was filled with phantoms, wandering hither and thither in restless haste, moaning as they went. Every one of them wore chains like Marley's ghost. Some few were linked together, none were free. Whether these creatures faded into mist or mist enshrouded them, I could not tell. But they and their spirit voices faded together. And then the night became as it had been when we had walked home. The silence was itself deafening. Scrooge closed the window and examined the door by which the ghost had entered. It was double locked, as he had locked it with his own hands, and the bolts were undisturbed. He looked at me across the room and began to say, "Humbug," but he stopped at the first syllable, looking around with a terrified expression, the likes of which I had never seen upon his face. Without another word, he went straight to bed without undressing, and fell asleep upon the instant. I followed, taking my place at his feet, keeping them warm as was my duty. I considered the events of the past few minutes, still not sure what I had witnessed or what meaning it held. I fought sleep for as long as I could, but as it had come to Scrooge, sleep eventually found me as well. Stave 2. The first of the 3 spirits. When I awoke, it was so dark that looking out of bed, I could scarcely distinguish the transparent window from the opaque walls of our bedchamber. I was endeavoring to pierce the darkness with my eyes when the chimes of a neighboring church struck the 4 quarters. This sound woke Scrooge. He sat up with great suddenness, and we lay abed together quietly, listening closely for the tolling of the hour. To our great astonishment, the heavy bell went on from 6 to 7, and from 7 to 8, and regularly up to 12, then stopped. 12, said Scrooge, looking to me with surprise. It was past 2 when we went to bed. That clock must be wrong. An icicle must have got into the works. 12 indeed. We listened for a long moment to the silence, hoping an answer to this riddle lay within the dark, quiet chamber. Why, is it possible, Carl, that we have slept through a whole day and far into another night? Said Scrooge. Is it possible that something has happened to the sun, and this is 12 noon? The idea being apparently an alarming one, he scrambled out of bed and groped his way to the window. I jumped down to the cold floor and followed. In order to see out, Scrooge was obliged to rub the frost off with the sleeve of his dressing gown, and even after that effort he could see very little. I pressed my nose up to the glass, my warm breath immediately lifting the frost before me. All that I could make out was that it was still dark, very foggy, and extremely cold. There was no noise of people running to and fro and making a great stir, as there unquestionably would have been if night had beaten off bright day and taken possession of the world. Scrooge went to bed again, and I followed, jumping up in a leap and quickly settling in. He sat and appeared to think and think and think and think it over. I watched him, content to be back in a warm bed. After much thought, he looked at me and shook his head, which I took to mean he could make no sense of it. "Marley's ghost," uttered Scrooge. "Every time I resolve within myself, after mature inquiry, that it was all a dream, my mind flies back again like a strong spring released to its first position, and I am presented with the same problem to be worked all through. Was it a dream or not?" If it was a dream, I thought, then it was a shared dream, for the memory of the ghostly visit vibrated within me still. Scrooge and I lay in this state until the chime had gone 3/4 more. Then he suddenly turned to me. "The ghost warned us of a visitation when the bell tolled 1, remarked Scrooge. "Therefore, I resolve to lie awake until that hour has passed." With that declaration made, we both lay on the bed, staring up, waiting for the bell to signal the next chapter of this evening's dark adventure, if that was to be. The quarter was so long that I was more than once convinced we must have sunk into an unconscious doze and missed the clock. At length it broke upon our listening ears. "Ding-dong." "A quarter past," said Scrooge, counting. I blinked in understanding. "Ding-dong." "Half past," said Scrooge. "Ding-dong." "A quarter to it," said Scrooge. "Ding-dong." "The hour itself," said Scrooge triumphantly, "and nothing else." He spoke before the hour bell sounded, which it then did with a deep, dull, hollow, melancholy tone. There was a second of silence, and Scrooge turned to me, ready to declare the ghost and his warning nothing more than a half-remembered dream. Before he could utter a word, a light flashed up throughout the room, and the curtains of his bed were drawn back. The curtains were drawn aside, I tell you, by a hand. Not the curtains at Scrooge's feet, nor the curtains at his back, but those to which his face was addressed. The curtains of his bed were drawn aside, and Scrooge and I, starting up into that half-recumbent attitude, found ourselves face to face with the unearthly visitor who drew them back. It was a strange figure, like a child, yet not so like a child as like an old man viewed through some supernatural medium. It gave him the appearance of having receded from view and being diminished to a child's proportions. Its hair, which hung about its neck and down its back, was white, as if with age, and yet the face had not a wrinkle in it, and the tenderest bloom was on the skin. The arms were very long and muscular, the hands the same, as if its hold were of uncommon strength. Its legs and feet, most delicately formed, were bare. It wore a tunic of the purest white, and round its waist was bound a lustrous belt, the sheen of which was beautiful. It held a branch of fresh green holly in its hand. But the strangest thing about it was that from the crown of its head there sprung a bright, clear jet of light by which all this was visible. "Are you the spirit whose coming was foretold to me?" asked Scrooge. "I am." The voice was soft and gentle. It was singularly low, as if, instead of being so close beside us, it was at a distance. My ears, at full attention, turned to try to place the location of the sound of this voice, which was at once here as well as over there. I cocked my head at the enigma. "Who and what are you?" Scrooge demanded. "I am the ghost of Christmas past." "Long past?" inquired Scrooge. "No, your past." "What business has brought you here?" "Your welfare," said the ghost. "Yes, that is all well and good," said Scrooge, appearing to summon more courage than I was feeling. "But a night of unbroken rest would have been more conducive to that end." This produced something akin to a laugh from the spirit. "Your reclamation, then. Take heed." It put out its strong hand as it spoke, and clasped Scrooge gently by the arm. "Rise and walk with me." My mind raced at the many objections my master could summon to such a request, that the weather and the hour were not adapted to pedestrian purposes, that the bed was warm and the thermometer a long way below freezing, that he was clad but lightly in his slippers, dressing-gown, and nightcap. However, the grasp, though gentle as a woman's hand, appeared not to be resisted by Scrooge. He stood and followed, with me directly by his side. Finding that the spirit made towards the window, Scrooge stopped, and I with him. There is a habit of mine, born from I know not where, of leaning my weight against my master when both of us are standing. Scrooge had tolerated the practice over the years with only minor complaint. But now the most wondrous thing did occur. I felt Scrooge lean his weight against me in that same fashion, as if requesting some much-needed physical or spiritual sustenance. I dug my feet in, and was happy to provide this rare request for support. "I am a mortal," Scrooge remonstrated, as he gestured toward the window, "and liable to fall." "Bear but a touch of my hand. There," said the spirit, laying it upon Scrooge's heart, "and you shall be upheld in more than this." Scrooge allowed the touch, at the same moment grasping my collar. He did so, perhaps a bit more tightly than may have been required. Given the bizarre nature of our circumstances, I let this pass without growl or comment. As the words were spoken, we passed through the wall and stood upon an open country road with fields on either side. The city had entirely vanished. Not a vestige of it was to be seen. The darkness and the mist had vanished with it, for it was a clear, cold winter day, with the snow upon the ground. "Good heavens!" said Scrooge, as he released his firm grasp on my collar. He clapped his hands together as he looked about him. "I was bred in this place. I was a boy here." The spirit gazed upon him with a small smile. "Your lip is trembling," said the ghost. "And what is that upon your cheek?" Scrooge muttered with an unusual catching in his voice that it was nothing, and begged the ghost to lead us where he would. "You remember the way?" inquired the spirit. "Remember it?" cried Scrooge with fervor. "I could walk it blindfolded." "Strange to have forgotten it for so many years," observed the ghost. "Let us go on." We walked along the road, me often running ahead and then doubling back to stroll alongside Scrooge. He appeared to recognize every gate and post and tree until a little market town appeared in the distance, with its bridge, its church, and winding river. Some shaggy ponies were seen trotting toward us with boys upon their backs. They called to other boys in country carts driven by farmers. All these boys were in great spirits and shouted to each other until the broad fields were so full of merry music that the crisp air laughed to hear it. I ran alongside the boys on the ponies, barking and jumping up to share in their high spirits. Despite my best efforts, I could not garner an ounce of their attention in my direction. "These are but shadows of the things that have been," said the ghost to me with a smile. "They have no consciousness of us." The travelers came on, and as they came, Scrooge knew and named them, every one of them. He appeared to be filled with gladness when he heard them give each other Merry Christmas as they parted at crossroads and byways for their separate homes. It was then I realized that they were each schoolboys headed home for Christmas. In the distance, I saw the mansion from where they had come. Given the number of boys who had passed, the structure would be nigh upon empty now. "The school is not quite deserted," said the ghost, as if he had somehow heard my thought. "A solitary child, neglected by his friends, is left there still." "I know," said Scrooge, and I heard a strange, muffled sound within his words. Was it a muted sob? We left the high road by a well-remembered lane, and soon approached the mansion of dull red brick. It was a large house, but one of broken fortunes, for the spacious offices were little used. Their walls were damp and mossy, their windows broken, and their gates decayed. There was an earthly aroma in the air, a chilly bareness in the place, which associated itself somehow with too much getting up by candlelight and not too much to eat. We went, the ghost and Scrooge and I, across the hall to a door at the back of the house. It opened before us and revealed a long, bare, melancholy room, made barer still by lines of plain chairs and desks. At one of these sat a lonely boy, reading near a feeble fire. It took but an instant for me to recognize the lad as Scrooge himself at a much younger age. I know not how I came to this understanding. It was upon me in an instant, and revealed itself at once as being true beyond measure. Before me I witnessed Scrooge not unlike the manner in which he had first laid eyes upon me, a young pup, innocent yet, but still sadly aware of the harshness the world might bring. Scrooge moved ahead of us and sat down heavily upon a chair. He appeared to weep to see his poor forgotten self as he had used to be. I felt his sorrow deeply. The boy, intent as he was upon his book, of course, saw none of this. The lad instead began to read aloud from his book. "And the Sultan's groom was turned upside down by the genie," the boy read with a laugh. "And there he is upon his head. Serves him right. I'm glad of it. What business had he to be married to the princess?" His delight in the story extended to Scrooge, who rose to peer over the young boy's shoulder and read along with him. To see Scrooge's excited face would have been, I'm sure, a surprise to his business acquaintances in the city indeed. "Poor Robin Crusoe! Where have you been, Robin Crusoe?" Scrooge read, and then turned to the spirit and me, excitedly explaining the details of the story. "The man thought he was dreaming, but he wasn't. It was the parrot, you know." His momentary happiness faded as quickly as it had appeared as he looked down at the small child. "I wish," Scrooge muttered, looking about after drying his eyes with his cuff. "But it's too late now." "What is the matter?" asked the spirit. "Nothing," said Scrooge, "nothing. There was a boy singing a Christmas carol at my door last night. I should like to have given him something, that's all." The ghost smiled thoughtfully and waved its hand. "Let us see another Christmas," he said, and change was once again upon us. The boy before us, Scrooge's former self, grew larger as these words were spoken, and the room became a little darker. The panels shrunk, the windows cracked, fragments of plaster fell out of the ceiling. How all this was brought about, Scrooge and I knew not, but once more a younger Scrooge was alone again when all the other boys had gone home for the jolly holidays. He was not reading now, but walking up and down, despairingly. Scrooge looked at the ghost, and with a mournful shaking of his head, glanced anxiously towards the door. It opened, and a little girl, much younger than the boy, came darting in. Putting her arms about his neck, she addressed him as her dear, dear brother. "I've come to bring you home, dear brother," continued the child, clapping her tiny hands and laughing in delight. "Home, Fan," returned the boy. "Yes," said the child, brimful of glee. "Home for good and all, home for ever and ever. Father is so much kinder than he used to be that home's like heaven. So I was not afraid to ask him once more if you might come home, and he said yes, and sent me in a coach to bring you. And you are never to come back here. But first, we're to be together all the Christmas long and have the merriest time in all the world." "You are quite a woman, little Fan," exclaimed the boy. She clapped her hands and laughed and tried to touch his head, but being too little, laughed again and stood on tiptoe to embrace him. Then she began to drag him in her childish eagerness towards the door. He, being glad to go, accompanied her. Our hazy trio followed the children out of the room. As we did, a terrible voice in the hall cried, "Bring down Master Ebenezer's box!" Moments later, Master Scrooge's trunk being by this time tied to the top of the coach, the children bade the school goodbye. Then they climbed in and drove gaily down the garden sweep, the quick wheels dashing the frost and snow from off the dark leaves of the evergreens like spray. I raced after them for several seconds, and then spun around and returned to Scrooge. I panted slightly at the sudden but welcome exertion. Scrooge absently patted my head as he watched the coach disappear. A look of sadness, like I had never seen, moving across his face. "Always a delicate creature, your sister Fan, whom a breath might have withered," said the ghost. "But she had a large heart." "So she had," said Scrooge, his voice a harsh whisper. "She died a woman," said the ghost, "and had, as I think, children?" "One child," Scrooge returned. "True," said the ghost. "Your nephew, Fred." Scrooge seemed uneasy in his mind, and so answered briefly. "Yes," he said as the coach finally disappeared from sight. An instant later, our surroundings vanished as well. Although we had but that moment left the school behind us, we were now in the busy thoroughfares of a city, where carts and coaches battled for the way, and all the strife and tumult of a real city were. It was made plain enough by the dressings of the shops that here, too, it was Christmas time. It was evening, and the streets were lighted up. Although snow covered the ground, I observed I made no prints as I walked alongside Scrooge. He left no footprints as well. And while the people around us, to whom we were unseen, were wrapped and swaddled against the cold, the wintry winds went unfelt by us. With my thin coat of fur, I was always chilled of a winter, spending as much time allowed on a floor near a fire. And yet I felt no chill as we marched unwrapped and uncapped through the wintry streets. The ghost, parading ahead of us, stopped at a certain warehouse door. "Do you know this place?" "Know it?" said Scrooge. "I was apprenticed here." And, as we had done before, we passed through the walls, one moment being in the street, and the next within the warehouse. We stepped from cold to warm, and yet felt neither. Scrooge cried in great excitement at sight of an old gentleman in a Welsh wig sitting behind a high desk. The desk was so high, I noted, that if he had been 2 inches taller, he might have knocked his head against the ceiling. "Why, it's old Fezziwig. Bless his heart, it's Fezziwig alive again," said Scrooge with a laugh, a sound I was still surprised to encounter emanating from my master. Old Fezziwig laid down his pen and looked up at the clock, which pointed to the hour of 7. He rubbed his hands adjusted his capacious waistcoat, and called out in a comfortable, rich, fat, jovial voice, "Yo-ho there, Ebenezer, Dick!" Scrooge's former self, now grown a young man, came briskly in, accompanied by his fellow apprentice. It was once again the most astounding of experiences to stand with my aged master at my side and witness his younger doppelganger mere feet ahead of me. Scrooge was astounded by the sight as well. "Dick Wilkins, to be sure," said Scrooge to the ghost. "Bless me, there he is! He was very much attached to me, was Dick." "Yo-ho, my boys," said Fezziwig. "No more work tonight. It's Christmas Eve, Dick. Christmas, Ebenezer. Let's have the shutters up," cried old Fezziwig with a sharp clap of his hands, "before a man can say Jack Robinson." You wouldn't believe how those two fellows went at it. They charged into the street with the shutters, 1, 2, 3, and had them up in their places, 4, 5, 6, barred them and pinned them, 7, 8, 9, and came back before I could have got to 12, panting like racehorses. To see Scrooge, even in this younger form, move so quickly was a delight. At that pace, he could have nearly overtaken me on foot, if such a race were ever said to be, although I wager I still would have won, if the course be a reasonable one. "Hi-ho!" cried old Fezziwig, skipping down from the high desk with wonderful agility. "Clear away, my lads! Let's have lots of room here!" It was done in a minute. Every movable was packed off as if it were dismissed from public life forevermore. The floor was swept, the lamps were trimmed, fuel was heaped upon the fire. In mere moments the warehouse was as snug and warm and dry and bright a ballroom as you would desire to see upon a winter's night. And then the space began to fill with people as a party came to life before our eyes. In came a fiddler with a music book and went up to the lofty desk where he made an orchestra of it. In came Mrs. Fezziwig, one vast, substantial smile. In came all the young men and women employed in the business. In they all came one after another, some shyly, some boldly, some gracefully, some awkwardly, some pushing, some pulling. In they all came, and away they all went, 20 couples, dancing at once, down the middle and up again, round and round in various stages of affectionate grouping. I raced in and around the dancers, jumping up and barking, delighting in the mood and the movement and the music. It was a celebration the likes of which I had never yet experienced. All the while, old Fezziwig clapped his hands and cried out, "Hi-ho!" There were more dances, and there was cake, and there was a great piece of cold roast, and there were mince pies and plenty of beer. Then old Fezziwig stood out to dance with Mrs. Fezziwig. They shone in every part of the dance like moons. I circled them as they danced, astounded at how fleet-footed the two were, given their age and girth. When the clock struck 11, this domestic ball broke up. Mr. and Mrs. Fezziwig took their stations, one on either side of the door. They shook hands with every person individually as he or she went out, wishing each a Merry Christmas. When everybody had retired but the two apprentices, they did the same to them, and thus the cheerful voices died away. During the whole of this time, Scrooge had acted like a man out of his wits. His heart and soul were in the scene, and with his former self, he corroborated everything, remembered everything, enjoyed everything, and underwent the strangest agitation. It was not until now, when the bright faces of his former self and Dick were turned from us, that he remembered the ghost. He suddenly became conscious that it was looking full upon him. It is a small matter said the ghost, "to make these silly folks so full of gratitude." "Small?" echoed Scrooge. "Why, is it not? Your Fezziwig has spent but a few pounds of your mortal money, 3 or 4 perhaps. Is that so much that he deserves this praise?" "It isn't that, Spirit," said Scrooge, clearly heated by the remark. "He had the power to render us happy or unhappy, to make our service light or burdensome, a pleasure or a toil. His power lay in words and looks, in things so slight and insignificant that it's impossible to count them up. The happiness he gave us was quite as great as if—" "Yes," said the spirit. "As if it cost a fortune," said Scrooge quietly. He looked at the spirit and then turned away quickly. "What is the matter?" asked the ghost. "Nothing particular," said Scrooge. "Something, I think," the ghost insisted. No, said Scrooge. "I should like to be able to say a word or two to my clerk just now, that's all." His younger self turned down the lamps as old Scrooge expressed this wish, and into the darkness we went. We reappeared moments later, the 3 of us, standing side by side in the open air. "My time grows short," observed the spirit. "Quick!" This was not addressed to Scrooge or to anyone whom we could see, but it produced an immediate effect. For again before us we saw another Scrooge, younger than my master, but yet older than Fezziwig's apprentice. This Scrooge was a man in the prime of life. His face had not the harsh and rigid lines of later years, but it had begun to wear the signs of worry and greed. There was an eager, ravenous, restless motion in the eyes, which revealed a dark passion which had taken root. This Scrooge was not alone, but sat by the side of a fair young woman. In her eyes there were tears, which sparkled in the light that shone out of the ghost of Christmas past. Although her voice was hardly that above a whisper, even from our distance we could hear her every word. "It matters little," she was saying softly, "to you very little. Another idol has displaced me, and if it can cheer and comfort you in time to come as I would have tried to do, I have no just cause to grieve." "What idol has displaced you?" the younger Ebenezer rejoined. "A golden one." As they spoke, I found myself drawn to them, moving away from Scrooge and the spirit. I drifted toward the couple, finding myself standing alongside the young woman. I looked up at her face, where I could see a single tear trailing slowly across her smooth countenance. I looked at the younger Ebenezer to see if he had registered the tear, but his face was frozen, staring off into the distance. "In this world there is nothing so hard as poverty," said he. "You fear the world too much," she answered gently. "I have seen your nobler aspirations fall off one by one until the master passion, gain, engrosses you." "What then?" he retorted. "Even if I have grown so much wiser, what then? I am not changed toward you. Am I?" She turned her head to look at him, but he had proffered his question without returning her gaze. Her hands moved absently through the air. At first I thought she was reaching out to pet me, as people often turn to animals, dogs in particular, when seeking solace. But I quickly recognized she was demonstrating no awareness of my existence. "Our contract is an old one," she said. "It was made when we were both poor and content to be so. You are changed. When it was made, you were another man." "I was a boy," he said impatiently. "Have I ever sought to change the course of our affiliation?" "In words, no, never." "In what, then?" in a changed nature, in an altered spirit," said the girl, looking mildly but with steadiness upon him. "Tell me, if we met today, would you seek me out and try to win me?" He seemed to struggle with this scenario in spite of himself. "You think not?" "I would gladly think otherwise if I could," she answered. "But if you were free today, do I believe you would choose a dowerless girl? I do not. And so I release you with a full heart for the love of him you once were." He was about to speak, but with her head turned from him, she resumed. "You may, and the memory of what has passed half makes me hope you will have pain in this, a very, very brief pain, and then you will dismiss the recollection of it gladly as an unprofitable dream from which it happened well that you awoke. May you be happy in the life you have chosen." She stood and walked away. After several moments, the young Ebenezer turned to watch her depart. To my eye, I did not see her return the gaze. "Spirit," said Scrooge, "show me no more. Conduct me home. Why do you delight to torture me?" "One shadow more," exclaimed the ghost. "No more," cried Scrooge. "No more. I don't wish to see it. Show me no more." But the ghost was relentless, and in the blink of an eye, we were in another place. It was a room, not very large or handsome, but full of comfort. Although up until this point on our travels, I had yet to physically feel cold or heat, the warmth of the room was immediately apparent to me. I took a step forward to allow the kind-heartedness to envelop me. Near to the winter fire sat a beautiful young woman, so like that last woman we had just seen that I believed, and I vouchsafe so did Scrooge, it must still be the same woman who had just left us at that other time in that other place. She was clearly a young mother, sitting opposite from what must have been her daughter. Although they appeared to speak, we were unable to hear their words. This was not due to our distance, but instead because the noise in the room was perfectly tumultuous. There were more children here than I or Scrooge, in his agitated state of mind, could count. The consequences were uproarious beyond belief, but no one seemed to care. On the contrary, the mother and daughter laughed heartily and enjoyed it very much. In fact, the latter soon began to mingle in their ruthless sports. What I would not have given to be one of them, though I never could have been so rude, no. My nature was such that I stood, like Scrooge had at Fezziwig's party, on the sideline, enjoying the laughter and the chaos. For his part, Scrooge seemed warmed by the events as well. Yet again, I felt him lean against me for support, which I endeavored to provide. But then a knocking at the door was heard, and such a rush immediately ensued that the mother, with laughing face, was borne towards it in the center of a flushed and boisterous group. They moved with such speed and energy that I felt myself step cautiously aside, fearing they might trample me in the rush. Of course, in my vaporous state, no such collision was likely to occur. They were just in time to greet the father, who came home laden with Christmas toys and presents. The shouts of wonder and delight with which the development of every package was received, I had never experienced such a thing. The joy and gratitude and ecstasy. By degrees, the children and their emotions grew beyond the parlor, and finally up they went to bed, and so the tumult subsided. Scrooge looked on, more attentively than ever, when the master of the house, having his daughter leaning fondly on him, sat down with her and her mother at his own fireside. What is he thinking, I wondered, as I looked up at Scrooge, his face a mask of mystery. Was he thinking that such another creature, quite as graceful and as full of promise, might have called him father, and been a burst of spring in the haggard winter of his life? As with all such attempts to read the minds of those around us, mine was honestly endeavored, but without genuine success. "Belle," said the husband, turning to his wife with a smile, "I saw an old friend of yours this afternoon." "Who was it?" "Guess." "How can I?" she added, laughing as he laughed. She turned her head and seemed to look directly at us, but I knew such was not possible, and yet her answer suggested otherwise. "Was it Mr. Scrooge?" "Mr. Scrooge it was. I passed his office window. It was not shut up, and he had a candle burning. I could scarcely help seeing him. His partner lies upon the point of death, I hear, and there he sat, alone, quite alone in the world." The woman offered no response, but her face flushed, I think, with momentary sadness. As quickly as it had arrived, it was gone. "Spirit," said Scrooge in a broken voice, "remove me from this place." "I told you, these were shadows of the things that have been," said the ghost. "That they are what they are, do not blame me." "Remove me," Scrooge repeated with sharp vehemence. "I cannot bear it. Take me back. Haunt me no longer." The spirit, in apparent response, removed its cap, revealing a bright light which streamed from under it in an unbroken flood upon the ground. Brighter and brighter grew the light, obscuring our surroundings as the winds whipped around us. Scrooge, perhaps without consciousness of doing so, grasped my collar and held me tight. In a flash, all was brightness, and in the next instant, both Scrooge and I were fast asleep. Stave 3, the second of the three spirits. I was awoken from the middle of a fine dream, a running dream to be sure, but whatever had transpired in that ethereal space disappeared into the air the moment I opened my eyes. Instead, I found myself snuggled warmly in my spot at the foot of the bed. Scrooge was sitting up, clearly trying to order his thoughts in some manner. I could not perceive from the evidence before me if Scrooge had been awoken by the bell, or if he had been sitting there, frozen in anticipation of its tolling. "Another one is coming, Carl," he said lowly, his eyes scanning the curtains which surrounded our bed. "The second messenger dispatched to us through Jacob Marley's intervention. Make no mistake, another one is coming." Rather than wait in anticipation of which of the curtains the new spectre would draw back, Scrooge pulled each of them open with his own hand. He lay back down, but did not tempt sleep. Instead, he established a sharp lookout around the bed. I joined him in this constant scrutiny, so that we would be in position to challenge the spirit on the moment of its appearance, as we did not wish to be taken by surprise. Although Scrooge was not the adventurous sort, I believe he was steeling himself, and was ready for a broad field of strange appearances. In my heart, I felt that nothing between a baby and a rhinoceros would have astounded him very much as we sat there together, waiting. Of course, being prepared for almost anything, he was not by any means prepared for nothing. Consequently, when the bell struck one and no shape appeared, he was taken with a violent fit of trembling. 5 minutes, 10 minutes, a quarter of an hour went by, yet nothing came. Although that was not entirely correct. All the time as we lay abed, there was visible a light which appeared to surround us like a hazy mist. This light, I felt, was more alarming than a dozen ghosts, as I was powerless to make out what it meant or precisely from where it came. Scrooge observed the light as well, and looked upon me as if I might be the keeper of its secret. I held no such knowledge, but one thought had occurred to me. I began to think the source and secret of this ghostly light might be in the adjoining room, from whence upon further tracing it seemed to shine. Scrooge followed the direction of my gaze, and, this new idea taking full possession of his mind, he got up softly and shuffled in his slippers to the door. I walked silently beside him. The moment Scrooge's hand was on the lock, a strange voice called him by his name and bade him enter. We obeyed. The room was our own, of that there was no doubt, but it had undergone a surprising transformation. The walls and ceiling were so hung with living green that it looked a perfect grove, from every part of which bright gleaming berries glistened. The crisp leaves of holly, mistletoe, and ivy reflected back the light as if so many little mirrors had been scattered about, and such a mighty blaze went roaring up the chimney as that dull hearth had never known in Scrooge's time or Marley's, or for many and many a winter season gone. Heaped up on the floor, to form a kind of throne, were all kinds and sorts of meats and plum puddings and fruits and steaming punch. In relaxed state upon this couch there sat a jolly giant, glorious to see. He bore a glowing torch in shape not unlike Plenty's horn, and held it high up to shed its light on us as we came peeping round the door. "Come in!" exclaimed the ghost. "Come in and know me better." We both entered timidly and hung our heads before the spirit, neither of us quite prepared to meet his gaze. "I am the ghost of Christmas Present," said the spirit. "Look upon me." I was the first to look up, and Scrooge followed my lead. The spirit was clothed in one simple, deep green robe, bordered with white fur. Its feet, observable beneath the ample folds of the garment, were bare, and on its head it wore no other covering than a holly wreath. Its dark brown curls were long and free. "You have never seen the likes of me before," exclaimed the spirit. "Never," Scrooge made answer to it. "And who do you bring as your companion?" It was a long moment before Scrooge realized the spirit was referring to me. This is Carl," said Scrooge, his words tumbling awkwardly from his lips. A dog." "A fine specimen indeed," the spirit agreed. "A great British dog with a Germanic name, no less. Scrooge, how very continental of you." "It is the name with which he was delivered to me," exclaimed Scrooge. "I have not had cause or desire to change it." He glanced down at me and gave me what, for him, might be considered a warm smile. "He has become a fine companion." Scrooge was still unwilling or unable to look the spirit directly in the eye. I had passed that point and studied the creature closely. Recognizing my gaze, the spirit offered what appeared to be a wink in my direction. "Spirit," said Scrooge, continuing submissively, "conduct me where you will. I went forth last night and learnt a lesson which is working now. Tonight, if you have more to teach me, let me profit by it." "Touch my robe." Scrooge did as he was told and held it fast, once again grasping my collar with his other hand. The holly, mistletoe, turkeys, geese, sausages, pies, puddings, fruit, and punch all vanished instantly. So did the room, the fire, the ruddy glow, and the hour of night. The next moment, we stood in the city streets on Christmas morning. The weather was severe, and the people made a rough but brisk and not unpleasant kind of music in scraping the snow from the pavement in front of their dwellings and from the tops of their houses. The sky was gloomy, and the shortest streets were choked up with a dingy mist, half thawed, half frozen, as if all the chimneys in Great Britain had, by one consent, caught fire and were blazing away to their dear hearts' content. There was nothing very cheerful in the climate or the town, and yet there was an air of cheerfulness abroad. The people who were shoveling away on the housetops were jovial and full of glee. They were calling out to one another, and now and then exchanging a facetious snowball, laughing heartily if it went right, and no less heartily if it went wrong. But soon the steeples called all good people to church and chapel, and away they came, flocking through the streets in their best clothes. And at the same time there emerged from scores of by-streets, lanes, and nameless turnings innumerable people carrying their dinners. The sight of these poor revelers appeared to interest the Spirit very much, for as their bearers passed, he sprinkled incense on their dinners from his torch, and it was a very uncommon kind of torch. Once or twice, when there were angry words between some dinner carriers who had jostled each other, he shed a few drops of water on them from it, and their good humor was restored directly, for they said it was a shame to quarrel upon Christmas Day, and so it was. "Is there a peculiar flavor in what you sprinkle from your torch?" asked Scrooge. "There is. My own." "Would it apply to any kind of dinner on this day?" asked Scrooge. "To any kindly given. To the poor most." "Why to the poor most?" asked Scrooge. "Because they need it most." We went on, invisible as we had been before, into the suburbs of the town. It was a remarkable quality of the ghost that, notwithstanding its gigantic size, he could accommodate himself to any place with ease. He stood beneath a low roof quite as gracefully and like a supernatural creature as it was possible, and yet he could have done the same within any lofty hall. And perhaps it was the pleasure the good Spirit had in showing off his power, or else it was his own kind, generous, hearty nature, and his sympathy with all poor men, that led him straight to the humble home of Scrooge's clerk. For there we went, and on the threshold of the door the Spirit smiled and stopped to bless Bob Cratchit's dwelling with the sprinklings of his torch. Then we were in the small house, just as Cratchit's wife laid the cloth, assisted by Belinda Cratchit. Meanwhile, Master Peter Cratchit plunged a fork into the saucepan of potatoes. And then two smaller Cratchits, boy and girl, came tearing in, screaming that outside the baker's they had smelt the goose and recognized it as their own. I swear, I could smell it as well. Did I know the children? I did, although this was the first I had laid eyes upon them. But I had heard of each and every one on those occasions when Scrooge had vacated the offices, and I sat at Cratchit's feet. He had spoken either to me or to the air about each child over the years, telling me of their births, their stumbles, and their delights to such a degree that I felt I knew them intimately. Perhaps there is something unseen but powerful in the nature of my breed, in that it inspires warm conversations and confessions with the humans around me. Or perhaps it is unique to my nature. Basking in luxurious thoughts of sage and onion, these young Cratchits danced about the table. They exalted Master Peter Cratchit to the skies, while he blew the fire until the slow potatoes, bubbling up, knocked loudly at the saucepan lid to be let out and peeled. I had never, in my 7+ years, been within a dwelling filled so completely with love and excitement for the season. The contrast to the dim rooms I shared with Scrooge was a stark one. He looked down upon me, and the expression on his face seemed to say as much. Was there an apology behind those eyes? Perhaps there was. "What is keeping your father, then?" said Mrs. Cratchit. "And your brother, Tiny Tim? And Martha wasn't as late last Christmas by half an hour." "Here's Martha, Mother!" cried the 2 young Cratchits. "Hurrah, there's such a goose, Martha!" "Why, bless your heart alive, my dear, how late you are!" said Mrs. Cratchit, kissing her a dozen times and taking off Martha's shawl and bonnet for her with loving zeal. "We'd a great deal of work to finish up last night," replied the girl, "and had to clear away this morning." "Well, never mind as long as you are here," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Sit down before the fire, my dear, and have a warm." "No, no, there's Father coming," cried the 2 young Cratchits, who were everywhere at once. "Hide, Mother, hide!" So Martha hid herself, and in came Bob Cratchit with at least 3 foot of comforter, exclusive of the fringe, hanging down before him. Upon his shoulder sat Tiny Tim. Alas, for Tiny Tim, he bore a little crutch, and had his limbs supported by an iron frame. I looked to Scrooge, who appeared to be surprised by this revelation. "Why, where's our Martha?" cried Bob Cratchit, looking round. Although he made with a serious expression, I could perceive he was already well in on the prank. "Not coming," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Not coming?" said Bob, as he sat heavily, moving young Tim to his knee. "Not coming upon Christmas Day!" It was clear Martha didn't like to see him disappointed, even if it were only in jest. So she came out prematurely from behind the closet door and ran into his arms. Meanwhile, the 2 young Cratchits hustled Tiny Tim and bore him off into the wash-house. "And how did Tim behave?" asked Mrs. Cratchit, after Bob had hugged his daughter to his heart's content. "As good as gold," said Bob, "and better. Somehow he gets thoughtful, sitting by himself so much. He thinks the strangest things you ever heard. He told me, coming home, that he hoped the people saw him in the church because he was a cripple, and it might be pleasant to them to remember upon Christmas Day who made lame beggars walk and blind men see." Bob's voice was tremulous when he told this, and then quavered more when he said that Tiny Tim was growing strong and hearty. Again, I turned to Scrooge to witness his reaction, but he had turned his head away from me and appeared to be studying a wall. Tim's active little crutch was heard upon the floor, and back came the small boy before another word was spoken. He was escorted by his brother and sister to his stool beside the fire. Bob, turning up his cuffs, as if, poor fellow, they were capable of being made shabbier, compounded a hot mixture in a jug with gin and lemons and stirred it round and round. Master Peter and the 2 ubiquitous young Cratchits went to fetch the goose, with which they soon returned in high excitement. Mrs. Cratchit made the gravy, ready beforehand in a little saucepan, hissing hot. Master Peter mashed the potatoes with incredible vigor. Miss Belinda sweetened up the apple sauce. Martha dusted the hot plates. The 2 young Cratchits set chairs for everybody, not forgetting themselves. At last, the dishes were set on, and grace was said. It was succeeded by a breathless pause, as Mrs. Cratchit, looking slowly all along the carving knife, prepared to plunge it in the breast. But when she did, and when the long-expected gush of stuffing issued forth, one murmur of delight arose all around the table. Even Tiny Tim, excited by the two young Cratchits, beat on the table with the handle of his knife and feebly cried, "Hurrah!" "There never was such a goose," said Cratchit, and I was inclined to agree. Its tenderness and flavor, size and cheapness were the themes of universal admiration. Eked out by the applesauce and mashed potatoes, it was a sufficient dinner for the whole family. Each of its small pleasures was greater than any meal upon which I had ever watched Scrooge dine. Everyone had enough, and the youngest Cratchits in particular were steeped in sage and onion to the eyebrows. But then the plates were changed by Miss Belinda as Mrs. Cratchit left the room alone, too nervous to bear witnesses to bring in the pudding. Her concerns had been expressed throughout the meal. Suppose it should not be done enough. Suppose it should break in turning out. Suppose somebody should have got over the wall of the backyard and stolen it while they were merry with the goose, a supposition at which the two young Cratchits became livid. All sorts of horrors were supposed. In half a minute, Mrs. Cratchit entered, flushed but smiling proudly, with the pudding. It looked like a speckled cannonball, so hard and firm, blazing in a dabble of ignited brandy and adorned with Christmas holly stuck in the top. "Ah, a wonderful pudding," said Bob Cratchit. "I regard this as the greatest success achieved by you since our marriage." "I do confess I had my doubts about the quantity of the flour," Mrs. Cratchit said. Everybody had something to say about it, but nobody said or thought what had come first to my mind, and I dare say to Scrooge's thoughts as well, that this was a small pudding for such a large family. While they feasted on it, I endeavored to catch his eye, but he could not be induced to look in my direction. At last the dinner was all done, the cloth was cleared, the hearth swept, and the fire made up. Then all the Cratchit family drew round the hearth in what Bob Cratchit called a circle, meaning half a one. While the chestnuts on the fire sputtered and cracked noisily, Bob held up his glass. "A Merry Christmas to us all, my dears. God bless us." "God bless us, every one," said Tiny Tim, the last of all. He sat very close to his father's side upon his little stool. "Spirit," said Scrooge, with a degree of interest he had never expressed before, "tell me if Tiny Tim will live." "I see a vacant seat in the chimney corner," replied the ghost, "and a crutch without an owner, carefully preserved. If these shadows remain unaltered, the child will die." "No, no," said Scrooge. "Oh, no, kind spirit. Say he will be spared." "If these shadows remain unaltered by the future, none other of my race will find him here," returned the ghost. "What then? If he is to die, he had better do it and decrease the surplus population." Scrooge hung his head to hear his own words quoted by the spirit. He appeared to be overcome with penitence and grief. I leaned into him with all the sympathy I could muster, and he gave me the rarest of gifts, a gentle pat across my back, followed by a light scratch behind my ears. So caught up was he in the prediction of the ghost that, truth be told, I doubt Scrooge was even aware of these actions. "Will you decide which men shall live, which men shall die?" said the ghost. "It may be that in the sight of heaven you are more worthless and less fit to live than millions like this poor man's child." Scrooge bent before the ghost's rebuke, and, trembling, cast his eyes upon the ground. But he raised them speedily on hearing his own name. "Mr. Scrooge," said Bob. "I'll give you Mr. Scrooge, the founder of the feast." "The founder of the feast, indeed!" cried Mrs. Cratchit, reddening. "I wish I had him here. I'd give him a piece of my mind to feast upon. I hope he'd have a good appetite for it." "My dear," said Bob, "the children! Christmas Day!" "It should be Christmas Day, I'm sure, on which one drinks to the health of such an odious, stingy, hard, unfeeling man as Mr. Scrooge," said she. "You know he is, Robert. Nobody knows it better than you do." "My dear," was Bob's mild answer, "Christmas Day." "I'll drink his health for your sake and the day's, not for his," said Mrs. Cratchit. "Long life to him, a Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year. He'll be very merry and very happy, I have no doubt." The children drank the toast after her. It was the first of their proceedings which, to my untutored eye, had no heartiness in it. I realized with great sadness that Scrooge was the ogre of this family. The mention of his name cast a dark shadow on the party, which was not dispelled for full 5 minutes. After it had passed away, they were 10 times merrier than before. I learned much about Bob Cratchit, whom I had been with in our offices for 7 years, yet had never witnessed this side of his nature. It was a pleasure to share their company. Bob Cratchit told them how he had a situation in his eye for Master Peter, which would bring in, if obtained, full 5 and 6 weekly. The 2 young Cratchits laughed tremendously at the idea of their Peter being a man of business. Martha, who was a poor apprentice at a milliner's, then told them what kind of work she had to do and how many hours she worked at a stretch. I don't have extensive experience with families, but a few minutes in their presence told me they were happy, grateful, pleased to be with one another, and contented with the time. And as they faded, looking happier yet in the bright sprinklings of the Spirit's torch at parting, I noticed Scrooge had his eye upon them, and especially on Tiny Tim until the last. By this time it was getting dark, and the snow was coming down hard. As the Spirit led Scrooge and I along the streets, the brightness of the roaring fires in kitchens, parlors, and all sorts of rooms was wonderful. Here the flickering of the blaze showed preparations for a cozy dinner, with hot plates baking through and through before the fire, and deep red curtains ready to be drawn to shut out the cold and the darkness. And now, without a word of warning from the ghost, we stood upon a bleak and desert moor, where nothing grew but moss and coarse, rank grass. Down in the west, the setting sun had left a streak of fiery red which glared upon the desolation for an instant. "What place is this?" asked Scrooge. "A place where miners live, who labor in the bowels of the earth," returned the Spirit. "But they know me. See?" A light shone from the window of a hut, and swiftly we advanced towards it. Passing through the wall of mud and stone, we found a cheerful company assembled around a glowing fire. We saw an old man and woman with their children and their children's children, and another generation beyond that, all decked out gaily in their holiday attire. The old man, in a voice that seldom rose above the howling of the wind upon the barren waste, was singing them a Christmas song. It had been a very old song when he was a boy, and from time to time they all joined in the chorus. The Spirit did not tarry there, but passing on above the moor, sped to the sea. To our horror, looking back, we saw the last of the land, a frightful range of rocks behind us. Our ears were deafened by the thundering of water as it rolled and roared beneath us. Built upon a dismal reef of sunken rocks, some league or so from shore, there stood a solitary lighthouse. Great heaps of seaweed clung to its base, and storm birds rose and fell about it like the waves they skimmed. But even here, 2 men who watched the light made a fire which shed out a ray of brightness on the awful sea. Joining their hands over the rough table at which they sat, they wished each other Merry Christmas. One of them, the elder, with his face all damaged and scarred with hard weather, struck up a sturdy song that was like a gale in itself. Again the ghost sped on, above the black and heaving sea, on and on, until being far away from any shore, we lighted on a ship. We stood beside the helmsman at the wheel, the lookout in the bow. The officers who had the watch, every man among them, hummed a Christmas tune, or had a Christmas thought, or spoke below his breath to his companion of some bygone Christmas day with homeward hopes belonging to it. And every man on board, waking or sleeping, good or bad, had a kinder word for one another on that day than on any day in the year. And the next moment, we were gone sailing blindly through a thick mist. It was a great surprise to Scrooge and myself, thus engaged, to hear a hearty laugh. It was a much greater surprise for us both to recognize it as his own nephew's. In an instant, we found ourselves in a bright, dry, gleaming room, with the spirit standing smiling by us and looking at that same nephew with approving affability. "Ha, ha!" laughed Fred. "I have not mentioned it before, but if you should happen, by any unlikely chance, to know a man more blessed in a laugh than Scrooge's nephew, all I can say is, I should like to know him too. Introduce him to me, and I will heartily cultivate his acquaintance." When Scrooge's nephew laughed in this way, holding his sides, rolling his head, and twisting his face into the most extravagant contortions, Scrooge's niece, by marriage, laughed as heartily as he, and their assembled friends roared out as well. "He said that Christmas was a humbug, as I live," cried Fred. "He believed it, too." "More shame for him, Fred," said Scrooge's niece indignantly. "He's a comical old fellow, Clara," said Fred. "However, his offenses carry their own punishment, and I have nothing to say against him." "I'm sure he is very rich, Fred," said Clara. "What of that, my dear?" said Fred. "His wealth is of no use to him. He doesn't do any good with it. He doesn't even make himself comfortable with it." "Well, I have no patience with him," observed Clara. "Oh, I have," said Fred. "I'm sorry for him. I couldn't be angry with him if I tried. Who suffers by his ill whims? Himself, always. Here he takes it in his head to dislike us, and he won't come and dine with us. What's the consequence? He loses this fine dinner. What do you say, Topper?" I looked toward the fellow whom Fred had indicated. One needn't have been a sight-hound to recognize this Topper clearly had his eye upon one of Clara's sisters. "Any bachelor is a wretched outcast," said Topper, with a pointed glance toward the sister, "who has no right to express an opinion on the subject." "Do go on, Fred," said Clara, smiling at the flirtation and clapping her hands. "I was only going to say," said Fred, "that the consequence of his refusal to make merry with us is that he loses some pleasant moments which could do him no harm. But I mean to give him the same chance every year whether he likes it or not, for I pity him." "Even a dog could not find a kind word to say of the man," offered Topper. "On the contrary, he owns a dog who dotes on him constantly, yet receives no love in return," said Fred. "He's not cruel to the animal, bless him, but he shows the dog no great affection." "That is the last of it," said Clara. "I have no patience for a man who cannot find it in himself to offer affection to a dog. A cat, perhaps, but not a dog." Scrooge looked down at me, a great sadness in his eyes. He patted my back with a gentle touch I had not yet experienced, and I leaned into him just as he leaned into me. No words were spoken, of course, but I think much was expressed in this mutual action. "He may rail at Christmas till he dies," continued Fred, "but I shall not support him in that. He will find me arriving there in good temper year after year and saying, 'Uncle Scrooge, how are you?' If it only puts him in the mood to leave his poor clerk £50, that's something. And I think I shook him yesterday." It was their turn to laugh now at the notion of his shaking Scrooge, but being thoroughly good-natured and not much caring what they laughed at, Fred encouraged them in their merriment and passed the bottle joyously. After tea they had some music. Clara played well upon the harp. She played, among other tunes, a simple little air which clearly had been familiar to Scrooge at some point. When this strain of music sounded, Scrooge appeared to soften more and more. But they didn't devote the entire evening to music. There was first a game at blind man's buff. I was new to the sport, but caught the rules quickly, and I no more believed Topper was really blind than I believe he had eyes in his boots. My opinion is that it was an arranged thing between him and Fred. The way Topper went after Clara's sister was an outrage on the credulity of human nature, knocking down the fire irons, tumbling over the chairs, bumping up against the piano, smothering himself amongst the curtains. Wherever she went, there went he. He always knew where Clara's sister was. She often cried out that it wasn't fair, and it really was not. But it was great sport, and I moved among the party-goers with unheard barking and unseen leaping, having as much, or more, perhaps, merriment than any of them. Clara was not one of the blind man's buff party, but was made comfortable with a large chair and a footstool in a snug corner where the ghost and Scrooge were close behind her. But she joined in the other games of the evening, guessing games of wit and humor. There might have been 20 people there, young and old, but they all played. And so did Scrooge. He wholly forgot, because he was so caught up in what was going on, that his voice made no sound in their ears. He oftentimes came out with his guess quite loudly, and very often guessed right as well. The ghost was greatly pleased to find him in this mood, and looked upon him with such favor that Scrooge begged like a boy to be allowed to stay until the guests departed. But this, the spirit said, could not be done. "Here's a new game," said Scrooge. "1 half-hour, spirit, only one." It was a game called Yes and No. It took me several minutes to ascertain the structure of the game, but once I did, I found it simplicity itself. For I know, as most dogs do, the keen difference in tone and outcome between the words yes and no. Under the strictures of the game, Fred had to think of something, and the rest of the group needed to determine what it was. For his part, Fred would only answer their questions yes or no, as the case was. The brisk fire of questioning to which he was exposed elicited from him that he was thinking of an animal, A live animal, rather a disagreeable animal, a savage animal, an animal that growled and grunted sometimes, and lived in London. More questions produced the information that it walked about the streets, wasn't led by anyone, didn't live in a menagerie, was never killed in a market, and was not a horse or a cow or a bull or a tiger or a dog or a pig or a cat. For his part, Scrooge joined in and was very much convinced and then very much disappointed that the creature was in fact not a bear, for he had every confidence in his guess. At every fresh question that was put to him, Fred burst into a renewed roar of laughter that was so inexpressibly tickled that he was obliged to get up off the sofa and stamp about the room. At last his wife, falling into a similar state, cried out, "I know what it is, Fred! I know what it is!" "What is it?" cried Fred. "It's your Uncle Scrooge!" Which it certainly was, as all the evidence presented had clearly indicated such a conclusion. Admiration was the universal sentiment, though some objected that the reply to "Is it a bear?" ought to have been yes. The reasoning was, an answer in the negative was sufficient to have diverted their thoughts from Mr. Scrooge, supposing that they had ever had any tendency that way. There was laughter all around, although I did note that Scrooge, who until moments before had been in what could only be described as high spirits, chose not to join in with the abundant mirth. "He has given us plenty of merriment, I am sure," said Fred, "and it would be ungrateful not to drink his health. I say, Uncle Scrooge!" "Well, well, Uncle Scrooge!" they cried. "A Merry Christmas and a Happy New Year to the old man wherever he is," said Fred. "He wouldn't take it from me, but may he have it nevertheless. Uncle Scrooge!" Scrooge had become so light of heart that he would have pledged the unconscious company in return and thanked them in an inaudible speech if the ghost had given him time. But the whole scene passed off in the breath of the last words spoken by his nephew, and we were once again upon our travels. Much we saw, and far we went, and many homes we visited, but always with a happy end. The spirit stood beside sick beds, and they were cheerful. On foreign lands, and they were close at home. By struggling men, and they were patient in their greater hope. By poverty, and it was rich. In misery's every refuge, where vain man in his little brief authority had not made fast the door and barred the spirit out, he left his blessing and taught Scrooge his precepts. It was a long night, if it were only a night, but I had my doubts of this, because the Christmas holidays appeared to be condensed into the space of time we passed together. It was strange, too, that while Scrooge and I remained unaltered in our outward forms, the ghost grew older, clearly older. I could see Scrooge had observed this change, but never spoke of it until we left a children's 12th night party. He looked at the spirit as we stood together in an open place. "Your hair is now gray. Are spirits' lives so short?" asked Scrooge. "My life upon this globe is very brief," replied the ghost. "It ends tonight." "Tonight?" cried Scrooge. "Tonight, at midnight. Hark, the time is drawing near." The chimes were ringing the 11:15 at that moment. "Forgive me in what I ask," said Scrooge. He was looking intently at the spirit's robe. I, too, had detected something, a motion of some kind, perhaps an animal beneath the robe. I stepped near, and sniffed closely, but the only aromas to meet my nose were the spices the spirit had so generously distributed throughout our journeys. "But I see something strange and not belonging to yourself protruding from your skirts," said Scrooge. "Is it a foot or a claw?" "It might be a claw, for all the flesh there is upon it," was the spirit's sorrowful reply. "Look here." From within the folds of his robe he brought forth 2 children, wretched, abject, frightful, hideous, miserable creatures. They knelt down at his feet and clung upon the outside of his garment. Both Scrooge and I turned away from the sight, the action as involuntary as a jolt of fear. "Oh, man, look here! Look! Look down here!" exclaimed the ghost. They were a boy and a girl, ragged, scowling, but prostrate, too, in their humility. Where graceful youth should have filled out their features, a stale and shriveled hand had pinched and twisted them and pulled them into shreds. Where angels might have sat enthroned, devils lurked, glared out menacingly. Scrooge started back, appalled. He retreated, putting myself between him and these creatures. "Spirit, are they yours?" "They are man's," said the spirit, looking down upon them. "This boy is ignorance. This girl is want. Beware of them both, but most of all, beware this boy, for on his brow I see the word doom." "Have they no refuge or resource?" cried Scrooge. "Are there no prisons?" said the spirit, turning on him for the last time with his own words. "Are there no workhouses?" The bell struck 12. Scrooge and I looked about for the ghost and saw it not. We were once again utterly alone. Scrooge reached a hand for my collar, and I stepped closer. And then, as the last stroke ceased to vibrate, we both turned and beheld a solemn phantom, draped and hooded, coming like a mist along the ground toward us. Stave 4. The Last of the Spirits. The phantom slowly, gravely, silently approached. When it came near us, Scrooge bent down upon his knee, for in the very air through which this spirit moved, it seemed to scatter gloom and mystery. I too bowed my head, extending my front legs before myself in what felt like necessitous supplication toward the force moving toward us. The phantom was shrouded in a deep black garment, which concealed its head, its face, its form. It left nothing of it visible, save one outstretched, bony hand. If not for this, it would have been difficult to detach this figure from the night and separate it from the darkness by which it was surrounded. I could feel that it was tall and stately when it came beside us, and its mysterious presence filled me with a solemn dread. I suspect Scrooge experienced the same emotions. He stood beside me, and I could feel his legs tremble, and not, I feared, from the cold. The spirit neither spoke nor moved. "Am I in the presence of the ghost of Christmas yet to come?" said Scrooge. The spirit answered not, but instead pointed onward with its hand. "You are about to show me shadows of things that have not happened but will happen in the time before us?" Scrooge pursued. "Is that so, spirit?" The upper portion of the garment was contracted for an instant in its folds, as if the spirit had inclined its head. That was the only answer offered to us. "Ghost of the future," Scrooge exclaimed, "I fear you more than any spectre we have yet seen. But as I know your purpose is to do me good, and as I hope to live to be another man from what I was, I am prepared to bear your company, and do it with a thankful heart. Will you not speak to me?" The figure offered us no reply. The hand was pointed straight before us. "Lead on," said Scrooge. "Lead on. The night is waning fast, and it is precious time to me. Lead on, spirit." The phantom moved away in the same manner as it had come towards us. Scrooge and I followed in the shadow of its garb, which bore us up and carried us along. We entered the city, and yet, to be honest, we scarcely seemed to enter the city. Instead, the city rather seemed to spring up about us and encompass us of its own act. But there we were, in the heart of it. The spirit stopped beside one little knot of businessmen. Observing that the hand was pointed toward them, Scrooge and I advanced to listen to their talk. "No," said a great fat man with a monstrous chin. "I don't know much about it either way. I only know he's dead." "When did he die?" inquired another. "Last night, I believe." "Why, what was the matter with him?" asked a third, taking a vast quantity of snuff out of a large snuff-box. "I thought he'd never die." "God knows," said the first, with a yawn. "What have they done with his money?" asked a red-faced gentleman. "I haven't heard," said the man with the large chin, yawning again. "Left it to his company, perhaps. He hasn't left it to me, that's all I know." This pleasantry was received with a general laugh. "It's likely to be a small funeral," said the same speaker, "for upon my life I don't know of anybody to go to it. Suppose we make up a party and volunteer." "I don't mind going if a lunch is provided," observed the red-faced gentleman, "but I must be fed if I make the effort." Another laugh. "When I come to think of it, I'm not at all sure I wasn't his closest friend," said the first speaker. The others turned at this remarkable statement. The man continued, "For once, he stopped and exchanged a word with me." This witticism produced another long laugh from the group. I knew Scrooge knew these men, for we had seen them on more than one occasion while we made our way through the streets on many a business day. Both Scrooge and I looked towards the spirit for an explanation. The phantom produced no answer, but instead glided on into a street. Its finger pointed toward two persons meeting. Scrooge and I stepped toward them and listened again, thinking the explanation might lie here. Scrooge knew these men also perfectly. They were men of business, very wealthy and of great importance. Scrooge had made a point of always standing well in their esteem, in a business point of view, as he often said to me, strictly in a business point of view. "How are you?" said one. "How are you?" returned the other. "Well," said the first, "Old Scratch has got his own at last, eh?" "So I am told," returned the second. "Cold, isn't it?" "Seasonable for Christmas time. You are not a skater, I suppose?" No, something else to think of. Good morning." Not another word. That was their meeting, their conversation, and their parting. I was at first inclined to be surprised the spirit should attach importance to conversations apparently so trivial. But feeling assured that they must have some hidden purpose, I set myself to consider what it was likely to be. They could scarcely have any bearing on the death of Jacob Marley, his old partner, for that was past, and this ghost's provision was the future. From his expression, I could deduce the same thoughts were moving within Scrooge as well. We left the busy scene and went into an obscure part of the town, which Scrooge and I had never visited before. The streets were foul and narrow, the shops and houses wretched, the people drunken. The whole quarter reeked with crime, with filth and misery. Far into this den of infamous resort, there was a low-browed beetling shop where iron, old rags, bottles, and bones were bought. Upon the floor within were piled up heaps of rusty keys, nails, chains, and refuse iron of all kinds. Sitting in among the wares he dealt in by a charcoal stove made of old bricks was a greyhound rascal nearly 70 years of age. Scrooge and I, escorted by the phantom, came into the presence of this man just as a woman with a heavy bundle slunk into his shop. But she had scarcely entered when another woman, similarly laden, came in as well. She was closely followed by a man in faded black, who was no less startled by the sight of them than they had been upon the recognition of each other. After a short period of blank astonishment, in which the old man with the pipe had joined them, they all three burst into a laugh.
"Let the charwoman be the first," cried she who had entered first. "Let the laundress be the second, and let the undertaker's man be the third. Fate has brought we three here all at once, that be sure." "You couldn't have met in a better place," said the old man, removing his pipe from his mouth. "Come into the parlour. Stop till I shut the door to the shop. Come into the parlour."
The parlour, as he called it, was the space behind a screen of rags. The old man raked the fire with an old metal rod, and having trimmed his smoky lamp with the stem of his pipe, put the pipe into his mouth again. While he did this, the woman, who had already spoken, threw her bundle on the floor and sat down in a flaunting manner on a stool. She crossed her elbows on her knees and looked with a bold defiance at the other two.
"What does it matter, then? What does it matter, Mrs. Dilber?" said the woman. "Every person has a right to take care of themselves. He always did." "That's true indeed," said the laundress. "No man more so." "Very well, then," cried the woman. "That's enough. Who's the worse for the loss of a few things like these? Not a dead man, I suppose?" "No, indeed," said Mrs. Dilber, laughing. "If he wanted to keep him after he was dead, why wasn't he natural in his lifetime?" pursued the woman. "If he had been, he'd have had someone to look after him when he was struck with death, instead of lying gasping out his last there alone by himself." "It's the truest word that ever was spoke," said Mrs. Dilber. "It's a judgment on him." "I wish it was a little heavier judgment," replied the woman. "Open that bundle, old Joe, and let me know the value of it. Speak out plain. I'm not afraid to be the first, nor afraid for them to see it. We knew pretty well that we were helping ourselves before we met here, I believe. It's no sin. Open the bundle, Joe."
The man in faded black, mounting the breech, stepped forward boldly and produced his plunder. It was not extensive. A seal or two, a pencil case, a pair of sleeve buttons, and a brooch of no great value were all. They were closely examined and appraised by old Joe, who chalked the sums he was disposed to give for each upon the wall. "That's your account," said Joe, "and I wouldn't give another 6 pence if I was to be boiled for not doing it. Who's next?" Mrs. Dilber was next. Sheets and towels, a little wearing apparel, 2 old-fashioned silver teaspoons, a pair of sugar tongs, and a few boots. Her account was stated on the wall in the same manner. "I always give too much to ladies. It's a weakness of mine, and that's the way I room myself," said old Joe. "That's your account. If you asked me for another penny and made it an open question, I'd repent of being so liberal and knock off half a crown." "And now undo my bundle, Joe," said the first woman. Joe went down on his knees for the greater convenience of opening it, and, having unfastened a great many knots, dragged out a large, heavy roll of some dark stuff. "What do you call this?" said Joe. "Bed curtains?" "Ah!" returned the woman, laughing and leaning forward on her crossed arms. "Bed curtains! You don't mean you took 'em down, rings and all, with him lying there?" said Joe. "Yes, I do," replied the woman. "Why not?" "You were born to make your fortune," said Joe, "and you'll certainly do it." "Don't drop that oil upon the blankets now." "His blankets?" asked Joe. "Whose else do you think?" replied the woman.
He isn't likely to take cold without 'em, I dare say."
"I hope he didn't die of anything catching, eh?" said old Joe, stopping in his work and looking up.
"Don't you be afraid of that. 'Twas age and anger did him in, that's all," returned the woman.
She gestured toward the next piece he examined.
"You may look through that shirt till your eyes ache, but you won't find a hole in it nor a threadbare place. It's the best he had, and a fine one, too. They'd have wasted it if it hadn't been for me."
"What do you mean, wasting it?" asked old Joe.
"Putting it on him to be buried in, to be sure," replied the woman with a laugh. "Somebody was fool enough to do it, but I took it off again."
Scrooge and I listened to this dialogue in horror.
"Ha ha!"
laughed the same woman when old Joe, producing a flannel bag with money in it, laid out their payments upon the ground.
"He frightened everyone away from him when he was alive, which profits us when he's dead."
"Spirit,"
said Scrooge, shuddering from head to foot.
I see. The case of this unhappy man might be my own. My life tends that way now. Merciful heaven, what is this?"
He recoiled in terror, for the scene had changed, and we were once again transported. The room was very dark, too dark to be observed with any accuracy. Scrooge and I glanced around us, anxious to know what kind of room it was. A pale light, rising in the outer air, fell straight upon a bed, and on it, plundered and bereft, unwatched, unwept, uncared for, was the body of a man. The form was covered in a gray, worn sheet. The rest of the bedding, the curtains, and all the linens had been stripped bare. Scrooge glanced towards the phantom. Its steady hand was pointed to the head. The cover was so carelessly adjusted that the slightest raising of it, the motion of a finger upon Scrooge's part, would have disclosed the face.
"Spirit," Scrooge said, "this is a fearful place. In leaving it, I shall not leave its lesson. Trust me. Let us go."
Still, the ghost pointed with an unmoved finger to the head.
"I understand you," Scrooge returned, "and I would do it if I could, but I have not the power, Spirit. I have not the power."
Again, it seemed to look upon him.
"If there is any person in the town who feels emotion caused by this man's death,"
said Scrooge, quite agonized,
"show that person to us, Spirit, I beseech you."
The phantom spread its dark robe before us for a moment like a wing, and withdrawing it, revealed a room by daylight, where a mother and her children were. I did not recognize the family or the abode. The young mother was expecting someone, and with anxious eagerness, for she walked up and down the room. At length, the long-expected knock was heard. She hurried to the door and met her husband, a man whose face was careworn and depressed, though he was as young as she. He sat down to the dinner that had been waiting for him by the fire, and when she asked him faintly what news, he appeared embarrassed how to answer. "Is it good," she said, "or bad?" "Bad," he answered. "We are quite ruined?" "No, there is hope yet, Caroline." "If he relents, there is," she said. "He is past relenting," said her husband. "He is dead." She was a mild and patient creature, if her face spoke truth, but she was thankful in her soul to hear it, and she said so with clasped hands. She prayed forgiveness the next moment, and was sorry, but the first was the emotion of her heart. "What I thought was a mere excuse to avoid me turns out to have been quite true. He was not only very ill, but dying then." "To whom will our debt be transferred?" "I don't know," said the man, "but before that time we shall be ready with the money. It would be bad fortune indeed to find so merciless a creditor in his successor. We may sleep tonight with light hearts, Caroline." Yes, their hearts were lighter. The spirit had done what was asked of it, showing us a home where people felt emotion at the man's death. However, I sensed this was not the precise emotion Scrooge had hoped to witness.
"Let me see some tenderness connected with the death,"
said Scrooge.
"or that dark chamber spirit which we left just now will be forever present to me."
The ghost conducted us through several streets familiar to my feet, and as we went along, Scrooge looked here and there to find himself, but nowhere was he to be seen. I assisted in this endeavor, searching every face upon the street for those familiar eyes. We entered poor Bob Cratchit's house, the dwelling we had visited before, and found the mother and the children seated round the fire. Quiet, very quiet. The noisy little Cratchits were still as statues in one corner. They sat looking up at Peter, who had a book before him. The mother and her daughters were engaged in sewing, but surely they were very quiet. The mother laid her work upon the table, put her hand up to her face.
"The color hurts my eyes," she said. "It makes them weak by candlelight, and I wouldn't show weak eyes to your father when he comes home for the world. It must be near his time."
"Past it, rather," Peter answered, shutting up his book.
"But I think he's walked a little slower than before these last few evenings, Mother."
They were very quiet again. At last she said, and in a steady, cheerful voice that only faltered once,
"I have known him to walk with Tiny Tim upon his shoulder very fast indeed."
"And so have I,"
cried Peter.
"Often." "And so have I,"
exclaimed another. So had all.
"But he was very light to carry," she resumed, intent upon her work. "And your father loved him so that it was no trouble, no trouble. And there is your father at the door."
She hurried out to meet him, and Bob, in his comforter, he had need of it, poor fellow, came in. His tea was ready for him on the hob, and they all tried to see who should help him to it most. Then the two young Cratchits got upon his knees, and each child laid a cheek against his face, as if they said, "Don't mind it, Father, don't be grieved." Bob was very cheerful with them, and spoke pleasantly to all the family. He looked at the work upon the table, and praised the industry and the speed of Mrs. Cratchit and the girls.
"You should be done long before Sunday," he said.
"Sunday? You went today, then, Robert?"
said his wife.
"Yes, my dear," returned Bob. "I wish you all could have gone. It would have done you good to see how green a place it is. But you'll see it often. I promised him that we would walk there on a Sunday." "My little child," cried Bob. "My little child."
He broke down all at once. He couldn't help it. He left the room and went upstairs into the room above, which was lighted cheerfully and hung with Christmas. We three arrived before he had climbed the stairs. There was a chair set close beside the child. Poor Bob sat down in it, and when he had thought a little and composed himself, he kissed the little face. He was reconciled to what had happened, and went down again quite happy. They drew about the fire and talked, the girls and mother working still. Bob told them of the extraordinary kindness of Mr. Scrooge's nephew.
"I met him in the street today, and he said I looked a little down, you know," said Bob, "at which, for he is the pleasantest spoken gentleman you ever heard, I told him our sad news. 'I am heartily sorry for it, Mr. Cratchit,' he said, 'and heartily sorry for your good wife.' By the by, how he ever knew that, I don't know." "Knew what, my dear?" "Why, that you were a good wife," replied Bob. "Everybody knows that," said Peter. "Very well observed, my boy," cried Bob. "I hope they do. 'Heartily sorry,' he said, 'for your good wife. If I can be of service to you in any way,' he said, 'give me his card. That's where I live. Pray come to me.' Now, it wasn't," continued Bob, "for the sake of anything he might be able to do for us, so much as for his kind way. It really seemed as if he had known our Tiny Tim, and felt with us.
I'm sure he has a good soul, said Mrs. Cratchit.
You would be sure of it, my dear, if you saw and spoke to him, returned Bob. I shouldn't be at all surprised, mark what I say, if he got Peter a better situation.
Only hear that, Peter,
said Mrs. Cratchit. It's just as likely as not one of these days, said Bob, though there's plenty of time for that, my dear. But however and whenever we part from one another, I'm sure we shall none of us forget poor Tiny Tim, shall we, or this first parting that there was among us. Never, father, cried they all. And I know, said Bob, I know, my dears, that when we recollect how patient and how mild he was, although he was a little child, we shall not quarrel easily amongst ourselves and forget poor Tiny Tim in doing it. No, never, father, they all cried again. I am very happy, said Bob. I'm very happy indeed. Mrs. Cratchit kissed him, his daughters kissed him, the two young Cratchits kissed him, and Peter and himself shook hands. The image of the happy family began to shift and disappear before our eyes.
Spectre, something informs me that our parting moment is at hand,
said Scrooge.
I know it, but I know not how. Tell me what man it was whom we saw lying dead.
As if in answer, the ghost of Christmas yet to come transported us once again. We next found ourselves in a churchyard, surrounded by dark moonlight, blowing leaves and gravestones. Here, I assumed, the wretched man lay underneath the ground. The spirit stood among the graves and pointed down to one. Scrooge took a trembling step toward it, and I followed. The phantom was exactly as it had been, but I dreaded that Scrooge saw new meaning in its solemn shape.
Before I draw near to that stone to which you point, answer me one question,
said Scrooge.
Are these the shadows of the things that will be, or are they shadows of the things that may be?
Still the ghost pointed downward to the grave by which we stood.
Men's courses will foreshadow certain ends, said Scrooge. But if the courses be departed from, the ends will change. Say it is thus.
The spirit was immovable as ever. Scrooge and I crept towards the stone. I felt him trembling as we went. We followed the finger and read upon the stone of the neglected grave his own name, Ebenezer Scrooge.
Am I that man who lay upon the bed?
Scrooge cried as he fell with sudden grief upon his knees. The finger pointed from the grave to him and back again.
No, spirit! Oh, no, no!
The finger still was there.
Spirit!
Scrooge cried, tightly clutching at its robe.
Hear me! I am not the man I was. Why show me this if I am past all hope?
For the first time, the hand appeared to shake.
Good spirit,
Scrooge pursued,
assure me that I yet may change these shadows you have shown me by an altered life.
The hand trembled.
I will honor Christmas in my heart and try to keep it all the year. I will live in the past, the present, and the future. The spirits of all three shall strive within me. Oh, but tell me I may sponge away the writing on this stone.
Holding up his hands in a last prayer to have his fate reversed, he saw an alteration in the phantom's hood and dress. It shrunk, collapsed, and dwindled down into a familiar shape. It was a bedpost. Stave 5. Christmas Day. Yes, and the bedpost was our own. The bed was our own. The room was our own. Best and happiest of all, the time before us was our own. Scrooge was sprawled on the bed beside me. He stared about the room in excitement, then turned to me and pulled my face toward him.
Carl, my friend, believe me in this. I will live in the past, the present, and the future,
said Scrooge.
The spirits of all three shall strive within me.
Scrooge scrambled out of the bed, and I jumped down next to him. He fell to the floor in exhilaration.
Oh, Jacob Marley, heaven and Christmas time be praised. I say it on my knees, old Jacob, on my knees.
He was so flustered and so glowing with his good intentions that his broken voice would scarcely answer to his call. He had been sobbing violently in his conflict with the spirit, and his face was wet with tears, and many of those tears were felt upon my back, but I cared not for the dampness. To see him in such a state, a joyous, happy state, was worth a flood of tears.
They are not torn down,
cried Scrooge, as he folded one of his bed curtains in his arms.
They are not torn down, Rings and all. They are here. I am here. The shadows of the things that would have been may be dispelled. They will be. I know they will.
His hands were busy with his garments all this time, turning them inside out, putting them on upside down, tearing them, mislaying them, making them parties to every kind of extravagance. I helped as best I could, bringing him the clothes from the floor, taking away the night clothes so they would not become confused within his wardrobe.
Carl, I don't know what to do,
cried Scrooge, laughing and crying in the same breath.
I'm as light as a feather. I'm as merry as a schoolboy. I'm as giddy as a drunken man. A Merry Christmas to everybody. A Happy New Year to all the world.
He had walked, no, scampered into the sitting room, and was now standing there, perfectly winded.
There's the door by which the ghost of Jacob Marley entered,
cried Scrooge, starting off again and going round the fireplace.
There's the corner where the ghost of Christmas present sat. There's the window where I saw the wandering spirits. It's all right. It's all true, Carl. Oh, my lovely dog, it all happened.
Really, I couldn't help but think, for a man who had been out of practice for so many years, it was a splendid laugh, a most illustrious laugh.
I don't know what day of the month it is, said Scrooge. I don't know how long we were among the spirits. I don't know anything.
He was stopped in his movements by the churches, ringing out the lustiest peals he had ever heard.
Oh, glorious, glorious!
He shouted. Running to the window, Scrooge flung it open and put out his head. I squeezed in next to him and took in the morning air. There was no fall, no mist, just stirring cold and sweet fresh air.
What's today?
Cried Scrooge, calling downward to a boy in Sunday clothes who loitered below.
I?
Returned the boy with all his might of wonder, surprised to see a slightly demented man and a greyhound dog staring down at him from the window above.
What's today, my fine fellow?
Repeated Scrooge.
Today?
Replied the boy.
Why, it's Christmas Day.
It's Christmas Day, said Scrooge as he turned to me. Carl, we haven't missed it. The spirits have done it all in one night. They can do anything they like. Of course they can. Of course they can. Hello, my fine fellow. Hello, returned the boy. Do you know the Poulters in the next street but one? Scrooge inquired.
I should hope I did,
replied the lad.
An intelligent boy, said Scrooge, and I nodded in agreement. A remarkable boy. Do you know whether they sold the prize turkey that was hanging up there? Not the little prize turkey, the big one.
What? The one as big as me?
Returned the boy. What a delightful boy, said Scrooge. It's a pleasure to talk to him. Yes.
It's hanging there now,
replied the boy. Is it? Said Scrooge. Go and buy it. Go and buy it and tell them to bring it here that I may give them directions where to take it. Come back with the man, and I'll give you a shilling. Come back with him in less than 5 minutes. I'll give you half a crown. The boy was off like a shot. Not as fast as a greyhound, to be sure, but mighty fleet of foot for a human of such small size. I'll send it to Bob Cratchit's, whispered Scrooge to me, rubbing his hands. He shan't know who sent it. It's twice the size of Tiny Tim.
The hand in which he wrote the address was not a steady one, but write it he did somehow. Together we went downstairs to open the front door, ready for the coming of the poulterer's man. As we stood there, awaiting his arrival, the knocker caught my eye. Scrooge noticed where I was looking, and he reached out to it.
I shall love it as long as I live, cried Scrooge,
patting the knocker with his hand.
Carl, I scarcely ever looked at it before. What an honest expression it has in its face, don't you think?
He looked at me for a response, but before I could determine how to do so, the young boy had returned with the poulterer.
"Here's the turkey!"
shouted Scrooge. It was a turkey indeed. He never could have stood upon his legs, that bird. He would have snapped them short off in a minute, like sticks of sealing wax.
"Why, it's impossible to carry that to Camden Town,"
said Scrooge to the winded man.
"You must have a cab."
The chuckle with which he said this, and the chuckle with which he paid for the turkey, and the chuckle with which he paid for the cab, and the chuckle with which he recompensed the boy, were only to be exceeded by the chuckle with which he sat down breathless in his chair. He chuckled till he cried, and then he laughed again, starting the cycle anew. Shaving was not an easy task, for his hand continued to shake very much. I have no personal experience with the process, but I know this much. Shaving requires attention, even when you don't dance while you're at it. But if Scrooge had cut the end of his nose off, he would have put a piece of sticking plaster over it and been quite satisfied. He dressed himself all in his best, and at last we got out into the streets. The people were by this time pouring forth, as we had seen during our time with the ghost of Christmas Present. Walking with one hand lightly upon my leash, Scrooge regarded everyone with a delighted smile. He looked so irresistibly pleasant that 3 or 4 good-humored fellows said, "Good morning, sir, a Merry Christmas to you." As Scrooge said often afterwards, that, of all the blithe sounds he had ever heard, those were the blithest in his ears. We had not gone far when, coming on towards us, we beheld one of the 2 gentlemen who had walked into our counting-house the day before. It was, I was sure, the one who had remarked Scrooge and Marley's, I believe. I sensed it sent a pang across Scrooge's heart to think how this old gentleman would look upon him when they met. But this new Scrooge knew what path lay straight before him, and he took it.
"My dear sir,"
said Scrooge, quickening our pace and taking the old gentleman by the hand,
"how do you do? I hope you succeeded yesterday. It was very kind of you. A Merry Christmas to you, sir."
"Mr. Scrooge?"
"Yes,"
said Scrooge.
"that is my name, and I fear it may not be pleasant to you. Allow me to ask your pardon, and will you have the goodness to accept—"
Here Scrooge whispered in the man's ear some words that were beyond my hearing.
"Lord bless me!"
cried the gentleman, as if his breath were taken away.
"My dear Mr. Scrooge, are you serious?"
"If you please," said Scrooge, "and not a farthing less. A great many back payments are included in it, I assure you. Now, will you do me a favor?"
"My dear sir,"
said the man, shaking hands with him again, this time more vigorously,
"I don't know what to say to such munificent—"
"Don't say anything, please,"
retorted Scrooge.
"Come and see me. Will you come and see me?"
"I will,"
cried the old gentleman, and it was clear he meant to do it.
"Thank you," said Scrooge. "I am much obliged to you. I thank you 50 times. Bless you."
This encounter was repeated in various and similar ways throughout our morning walk. We went to church, and walked about the streets, and watched the people hurrying to and fro. Scrooge patted children on the head, and questioned beggars, and looked down into the kitchens of houses, and up to the windows, and found that everything could yield him pleasure. In the afternoon, he turned our steps toward his nephew's house. He passed the door a dozen times before he had the courage to go up and knock. I paced back and forth with him, gently tugging him toward the door, but he was determined, I could see, to move at his own speed. Finally, he followed me to the door and knocked.
"Is your master at home, my dear?"
said Scrooge to the girl who answered his knock.
Yes, sir. He's in the living room, sir, along with mistress. I'll show you in, if you please.
"Thank you. He knows us,"
said Scrooge, his hand already on the dining room doorknob. He turned it gently and sidled his face in round the door.
"Fred,"
said Scrooge. Dear heart alive, how his niece by marriage started. Scrooge had not noticed for the moment her sitting in the corner with the footstool. "Why, bless my soul!" cried Fred. "Who's that?"
"It's I, your Uncle Scrooge. I have come to dinner. Will you let me in, Fred?"
Let him in? It is a mercy he didn't shake his arm off. We were very much at home in 5 minutes. Nothing could be heartier. His niece looked just the same. So did Topper when he came. So did everyone when they came. Wonderful party, wonderful food, delicious treats were procured for me by the cook. Wonderful games, wonderful unanimity, wonderful happiness. We were sated indeed, but we were not finished. We were early at the office the next morning. The plan, as I was led to understand it, was to catch Bob Cratchit coming late. That was the thing Scrooge had set his heart upon. The clock struck 9. No Bob. 1/4 past. No Bob. He was a full 18 minutes and a half behind his time. Scrooge sat with his door wide open that he might see him come in. I sat at his feet waiting in anticipation of what was to come. Cratchit's hat was off before he opened the door, his comforter, too. He was on his stool in a jiffy, driving away with his pen as if he were trying to overtake 9 o'clock.
"Cratchit!"
growled Scrooge in his accustomed voice, as near as he could feign it.
"What do you mean, coming here at this time of day?"
I'm very sorry, sir, said Bob. I am behind my time.
"You are," repeated Scrooge. "Yes, I think you are. Step this way, sir, if you please."
It's only once a year, sir,
pleaded Bob as he shuffled toward us, his head lowered.
It shall not be repeated. I was making rather merry yesterday, sir.
"Now, I'll tell you what, my friend," said Scrooge. "I'm not going to stand this sort of thing any longer. And therefore—"
Scrooge leapt from his stool and gave Bob such a hug that I thought the younger man might faint from the pressure.
"And therefore," repeated Scrooge, "I am determined to raise your salary."
Bob pulled away trembling. I could see him scan the room, perhaps to locate some means of defense.
"A Merry Christmas, Bob,"
said Scrooge with an earnestness that could not be mistaken as he clapped him on the back.
"A merrier Christmas, Bob, my good fellow, than I have given you for many a year,"
Scrooge continued as he pulled the young, confused man closer.
"I'll raise your salary and endeavor to assist your struggling family. We will discuss your affairs this very afternoon over a Christmas bowl of smoking bishop. Now, make up the fires to warm this place before you dot another I, Bob Cratchit."
Scrooge was better than his word. He did it all and infinitely more. To me, he had nothing but warmth, love, and affection. A better, kinder master could not be found upon this earth. Gone were the rags upon the floor near his desk, replaced with a feather bed worthy of a king. No longer did I dine on scraps and leftovers, but instead ate as well, and on occasion better, than Scrooge himself. Our walks were long, our time together delightful, our love for each other without bounds. And to Tiny Tim, who did not die, he was a second father. He became as good a friend and as good a man as the good old city knew. Some people laughed to see the alteration in him, but he let them laugh, and little heeded them, for he was wise enough to know that nothing ever happened on this globe for good at which some people did not have their fill of laughter. His own heart laughed, and that was quite enough for him. We had no further intercourse with spirits, and it was always said of him that he knew how to keep Christmas well, if any man alive possessed the knowledge. May that be truly said of us, and all of us. And so, as Tiny Tim observed, God bless us, everyone.
This has been A Christmas Carol, a Greyhound ghost story of Christmas, written by Charles Dickens and John Gaspard, read by Jim Cunningham. Text copyright 2020, production copyright 2021, all rights reserved. Recorded by Albertsbridge Books at Grass Lake Studios. Find the companion audiobook to this one, The Greyhound of the Baskervilles, at albertsbridgebooks.com. That's ALBERTS bridgebooks.com. And thanks for listening.